right, there he is. Okay, full house. All right, I'm going to call to order the Royal Oak City Commission special work session for recreational and adult use establishments. We're going to begin with the roll call. Mayor Mike Fournier here. Commissioner Perush?
Here.
Commissioner Douglas?
Here.
Commissioner Gibbs?
Here.
Commissioner Dubuck?
Here.
Commissioner Lavasser?
Here.
Commissioner Macy? Commissioner Macy? Commissioner Macy. Okay, looks like Commissioner Macy may be having some technical issues. We do see her here on the grid. Okay, Commissioner Macy, we can't hear you. So once you figure that out, feel free just to chime in and do a test at any time for your audio.
She is here, Mayor, and it indicates that her audio is not muted, so she must be having some sort of issue.
Okay, you're going to have to perform the rest of the workshop using interpretive dance only, Commissioner Macy. Is that acceptable to you? Okay. Figure out if you can get that microphone working, because you're a valuable contributor to this commission and we want to make sure we hear you. But what we'll do is we'll start with here item 3, which is public comment. Ms. Schwanger, did we receive any public comment ahead of today's work session?
Mayor Fournier, we had the public comment line open for 2 hours and we received 2 comments, and
okay.
I will those for you right now.
Thank you, Ms. Schwanger.
Oh.
Hi, my name is Vincent Brown. I live at 518 South Vermont in Royal Oak. My concern with marijuana establishment ordinance that's on the docket tonight is the idea of flippers, is what the industry calls them, is folks that come into a city with the idea, they sell the city on the idea of opening, say a provisioning center, and then once they are awarded the license, they give it to the highest bidder. This is very concerning because you're not giving the license to the ending operator, and we've seen in multiple cities that surround Royal Oak, Hazel Park, Centerline, Ferndale, where they've switched hands multiple times before the final license and operator's in place. This has come with litigation and many other issues, and I think we need to be cognizant moving forward with the ordinance that we award these to the ending operator. That's all. Thank you very much.
This is Mike Moore. I'm over 4456 Arlington Street in Royal Oak. I wanted to comment about the marijuana. Thinking about opening and having marijuana stores open in our city, I just want to remind you that first thing, it is illegal in the U.S. It's a federal law that you would be breaking. That's number one, that it's illegal. Number two, let's see, I don't see that the better cities around us are like Birmingham or Bloomfield or promoting this in any way. I just think this makes us look more like a second-class citizen. Number three, I can't imagine how this is going to send a good message to children when they watch their parents sitting around smoking marijuana, getting high. I can't think how that's going to be a good thing. Number four, I think it's going to draw a lot of undesirables into our city, because a lot of the cities are not selling this. The people will be coming in here to buy their drugs. So I don't think that's a good plan. And number five, I don't see how anything good can come from something that is basically just used to make people get high. Thank you. Mike McGuire.
And that concludes the public comment, Mayor Fournier.
Thank you, Ms. Schwanger. All right, we're moving along. Item number 4 on tonight's work session agenda, current city ordinances. And I suspect I'm going to allow Mr. Gillum to kind of kick us off here for the rest of the agenda.
That's correct. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. Good evening. Seems like we just did this, doesn't it? So, for Jessica and Tom's benefit, we had our regular city commission meeting last night. So, along those lines, let me begin by introducing a couple new faces that are on the grid tonight. First, we have Jessica Wood and Tom Forshee from Dickinson Wright. Our friend Laura Bassett wasn't able to be with us tonight, so she asked two of her finest and ablest partners to join us from over on the west side of the state. I think you guys are both over in Grand Rapids still. Is that correct? And they're shaking their heads. So Jessica and Tom are up to speed. Laura's been copying them on any communications that she and I have been sharing for the last couple of months. So I'm sure they're going to do a fine job for us tonight. So the last time we met to talk about marijuana in general was in early February. You'll recall that we did have another work session scheduled for March, and then COVID hit, and that was the end of that. So I thought it might be appropriate for me to just kind of give a brief review of where we're at from an ordinance standpoint here in the city, and then also in terms of procedure where we've been before. The first issue that we had talked about previously had to do with medical marijuana itself, as opposed to adult use and recreational marijuana. There are really a couple different pieces of legislation that are involved here in terms of current marijuana licensing. The Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, or the MMFLA, which was from 2016, provides for the licensing of medical marijuana facilities. And if you recall, when we met back in February, the consensus of the commission was, at least at this point, that we really weren't interested in pursuing any kind of a framework for medical marijuana licensing. That instead we were going to focus our attention on a framework for adult use or recreational licensing. So we really haven't done any work as far as medical marijuana is concerned since that work session back in February. In terms of recreational or adult use marijuana, then we're talking about the MRTMA, the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act, which was enacted in 2018, which provides for a licensing framework for adult use or / recreational marijuana establishments. The MRTMA is opt-out legislation, which means that unless we took action to opt out of recreational or adult use marijuana, we would have recreational or adult use marijuana here in the city. And that's in contrast to medical marijuana, where you actually had to opt in. And we had never opted into medical marijuana, so we don't have medical marijuana here in the city either. But with recreational marijuana, at this point, we have opted out. We've actually opted out a couple times, but the intention when we opted out was to give us time to, number one, wait for the state regulations to come out late last year, which they finally did. And then also for us to put the appropriate regulatory framework in place, either through a licensing ordinance or a zoning ordinance amendments, or a combination of both. So we currently are opting out of recreational marijuana. Our current opt-out is scheduled to expire on August 15th. You'll recall that just within the last month or 6 weeks or so, we adopted the most recent version of the opt-out ordinance. So at this point in time, we've got roughly 3 months to try to get a framework into place. So just to kind of touch on the highlights of the MRTMA, it provides for 6 different types of licenses, a grower license with 3 different classes depending upon the number of plants, either class A, B, or C, a processor license, a secure transporter license, a retailer license, the safety compliance facility license, and the micro business license. And I know we talked a fair amount about the micro business license. That allows for the cultivation, processing, packaging, and sale of marijuana in one location, as opposed to being at different licensed facilities throughout the chain of production. Under the MRTMA, the city can limit the number and type of each of the different class of establishment licenses. So we can pick and choose. We could allow some of one, none of another, put a limit on whatever ones we choose to allow. The caveat to that is if whatever kind of a limit or a cap that we put in place on the number of license is exceeded by the number of applicants that apply to the state for that kind of a license. So in other words, if we said we're going to allow 6 processor licenses, hypothetically, here in the city, and there were more than 6 applications that were filed, and the applicants met the state standards, at least initially, for a license, then we would have to have some kind of a competitive process in place to determine which of the applicants would get those particular 6 licenses. When we were last together, Laura and I had talked to you and had kind of made our case for using zoning regulations to establish a limit on the number of licenses based upon the number that could actually be fit within particular zoning districts and within particular setbacks, as opposed to relying on the competitive process. Our concern with the competitive process is that there's going to be some subjectivity involved there, and we're inviting a lawsuit if we rely on anything other than zoning. At the same time, the City Commission did express a strong interest in having some kind of a competitive process and was interested in finding out what a competitive process might look like, what kind of things could be considered, what kind of things couldn't be considered. So that was kind of the back and forth that we had the last time we met. One of the things that we were going to try to come back to you with is some idea of what a competitive process might look like. And hopefully that's something that Jessica and Tom are going to be able to help us with tonight. Before we drive into that, I guess it would also be appropriate to get a review from Tim Twing, our Community Development Director. We do have a zoning ordinance recommendation for amendments that came forward from the Planning Commission to restrict the location of establishments within the city. So, Tim, can you give us just a brief overview of what came out of the Planning Commission before, please?
Sure. The Planning Commission document that went to the City Commission and that I sent out the other day via email was based on their recommendation from November 12th, 2019 in the public hearing held at that time. It did address both recreational marijuana establishments and medical marijuana facilities, and it had provisions in the ordinance that was recommending to cover both. So if the decision was to eliminate medical marijuana, we would have to go back and take those provisions out of the ordinance that was forwarded as a recommendation from the Planning Commission. The first couple pages of that communication I sent out had some bullet points in it as to what the ordinance covered, what it would allow, obviously all the definitions, the types of uses, which districts, which basically we were dealing with 2 zoning districts, general business, and then the general industrial districts were the 2 that you may recall that establishments and facilities could be allowed. Basically, the general industrial would also allow the growers, processors, and compliance facilities, more of the industrial type uses. We were not allowing under that ordinance any any marijuana facilities in any of the other zoning districts, office service, neighborhood business, central business district, or the mixed use. Secondly, they were all going to be treated as a special land use, requiring a special land use permit with a recommendation from the Planning Commission to the City Commission. So the City Commission would be the final decision maker on the issuance of a special land use permit. I think the intent there was to do that in concert with the license application that may be submitted and required as that comes through that process. Some of the submission requirements are going to be all the ones obviously for special land use, but before we would process them, an applicant would have to show that they are pre-qualified at the state. They would also have to show that they've completed an application and submitted that to the city before we would take in an application for special land use. In terms of setbacks, based on input, the 1,000-foot setback from all the K through 12 public schools. There were no setbacks proposed from religious institutions, parks, or residential zones. There was also a requirement for a 1,000-foot setback between retailers, micro businesses, provisioning centers, and such. There would be no setback required between growers, processors, or compliance facilities in the industrial area. I won't go through the rest of it, but there were a lot of other architectural items, green infrastructure items that the Planning Commission included in their recommendation, and again are bullet pointed in the commission letter that I sent out. So I'd be happy just to hear if there's any questions or comments on that draft that was presented again back early in the year.
Questions? Questions for Mr. Twain? Mr. Gillum.
Not a question, but I guess just a general comment. The 1,000-foot setback that Tim was talking about from existing schools, that's the maximum setback that's allowed under the state act. So we could have a smaller setback if we chose to. But I think the thought of the Planning Commission, and I think it makes sense, is that initially anyway, to start with the maximum setback and then have the ability to reduce the setback going forward to potentially allow other establishments to come in. On the other hand, it would be much more difficult if we had a smaller setback and we found that that didn't work and we went to push the setback out. We'd be dealing with businesses that were already legally and lawfully established within the setbacks that had been in place. So that's the maximum. And then my understanding from the discussions that I've had with Tim and Doug Hedges, who's also in on the meeting tonight, that kind of a maximum establishment scenario, if you squeezed in pretty much as many licenses or licensed establishments as possible within the general industrial and the general business zoning districts that are proposed, we could have as many as 18 different locations. Potentially that could be more than 18 licenses, just because the different classes of licenses can be stacked in the same location. But generally speaking, we're talking about, I won't say a worst case scenario, but a highest number scenario of as many as 18 licensed locations within those zoning districts.
Commissioner Lavasser.
If I'm understanding correctly, for retail establishments, there would be a required buffer between those establishments.
That's correct.
All right. My question or concern, I guess, would be, and that would seem to be a race to see who could get set up first. And I'm wondering if there's potential for liability or legal legal challenges that we could face there if you have a disgruntled applicant who came in second, so to speak, and as a result was eliminated by that buffer requirement. And if there's something that we can do to potentially avoid that type of risk to us.
Well, since it was a legal question, I think I'll let Dave answer from the standpoint of our legal liability or concerns. I would simply indicate that we do have other uses that have separation requirements. So it's not an uncommon activity or requirement in the zoning ordinance. They would have the opportunity to an appeal process under the ordinance in that regard to do something shorter, but it's a common practice to have separations between restricted uses.
Sure. And the thought I'm having here is, it's, you know, if let's say there was some sort of defect in the process, let's say they say we lost their application or something, or they were delayed because of something that we did, and that would be the potential concern as I would see it.
I suppose that's going to be a potential concern no matter what the process is going to be. I think the key there is having the process spelled out clearly in the licensing ordinance, and then making sure, to be honest, that our staff understands what the process is and document the steps that they take going forward, going through the process.
And I think the worst case scenario, would be a settlement like we have in other cases where, you know, you're allowed to open. You know, it wouldn't be like a punitive lawsuit, I would have imagined. It would be, okay, well, I guess we'll have one within 1,000 feet. Am I wrong in that? I mean, when I think about the worst case penalties?
Well, it would depend upon the nature of the claims. I mean, if you're talking about someone that wasn't able to open, excuse me, for a period of 6 months or a year or something like that, you're potentially looking at a claim for lost profits and monetary damages, in addition just to the fact that they like to obtain the license. So.
That's pretty much under any approach, though, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah. Yep, that would be true. Yes.
Commissioner Dubak?
I think Commissioner Purge was up before me.
Commissioner Purge?
My recollection of the discussion that we had back in February was that when you mentioned the potential of 18 businesses, we all kind of went, whoa, you know, we really were comfortable with businesses coming into the city, but the 18 number was a little bit more than I think a lot of us had in mind. And what we were stuck on was how could we tweak the zoning ordinance a little bit to kind of get that number down a little bit. Has the staff considered that issue at all and discussed any options for tweaking the zoning ordinance so that perhaps that number would come down a little bit? Or maybe I am misrepresenting what everybody else thought back then. To me, that seems high, but maybe the rest of you all are all comfortable with it.
Well, from the staff standpoint, I think one of the items, and again, it was a rough approximation about how many licenses that could be. And it was based on if you started at the north end of Woodward Avenue, because that's where our general business districts are, and plotted one every 1,000 feet apart to the south end where general business ends at roughly around 11 Mile Road. And then you also went into the industrial districts and tried to separate them. Now, keep in mind too, the Planning Commission was recommending that there not be a separation between grow facilities, processors, and some of those uses. So those could be right next door to each other. Obviously, if they added a retail license in there, then they would have a separation requirement. So that's one nuance to that number also, is that in the industrial district, you could have grow facilities next to grow facilities.
So let me make sure, because I have difficulty reading the zoning maps just because of my eyes, generally the general business district is just the area along Woodward Avenue. It does not extend along 11 Mile at all?
That's correct. The only other general business is up off Coolidge, up by Myers, English Gardens, in that area. Other than the Woodward corridor, the commission rezoned 3 properties on North Main Street a few months back, but that was the only 3 properties that were outside of Woodward Avenue.
Okay. Thanks.
Commissioner Dubak?
Okay, so we've had, a lot of this conversation multiple times. I think the questions that staff is looking for direction on are where and how many, and then how do we choose if there's a limit, right? And we've had some debate about choosing, and clearly there's legal peril with that because of the way that this the law has been crafted. There's just a lot of unknowns and a lot of blind spots that there's going to be exposure. The only way to 100% avoid, legal exposure on this is to not have it, but that's not an option when 70% of your residents vote in favor of it. So I think we have to have some tolerance for risk and make the best possible decision we can, aligned with what we think is in the best interest of our community. I think we've, by and large, there's consensus we are moving forward with this, right? So the where is on the table with the zoning. I'm okay with what's been proposed, but I do think we need to make a special place for micros for the reasons we discussed. There's a competitive disadvantage to be a micro outfit bidding for limited real estate in a limited market. Also, I think there's value to the community in having that type of establishment, but it's only going to happen if we allow for spaces for it. So in addition to what's on the table, what I would like to see is I would like for us to discuss overlay district in some neighborhood business areas and also the CBD. And I know we've been apprehensive about the CBD. A plurality of our polling shows a plurality of people support REC and CBD. It was just the only thing that didn't get into a majority, but it was still more people supported the CBD than opposed it. But I think given our current economic situation, if there's an industry chomping at the bit to hang a shingle in our business district, we should probably be open to that. And I think residents are open to that. So that would be the addition I would make to the where. The how many, I think it should be limited. I don't think it should be only limited by the zoning. And I think that's where we're getting hung up a little bit. What we've seen is some of our neighbors have come up with processes for distributing a certain number of licenses. And I think as a group, if we don't open doors to litigation by everyone having something different, if we just really kind of model after each other, so they're not able to point to courts and say, well, this isn't fair because these guys are doing this and these guys are doing this. But if there's a standard between us and Berkeley and Ferndale, and they're very much along the same lines as to how we're doing selection, I think that's probably a good place to start, is to look at that as to whether or not it's by zoning type that we're saying what the number is, but the selection criteria, just aligning with our neighbors. So the where, the how many, and then the how, right? So how many, I think, is up to conversation. I think we do need to start, my position is we need to start with a limited number because there's a lot of unknowns about how this impacts the community, the areas around it. I think a lot of the concerns about the parking are unfounded because I think once these are as common as liquor stores in the region, you're not going to have massive parking demand. But we don't know, as a new business type, what the impact is on the surrounding area. So I think it makes sense to limit it. And then, I think the how we limit, we mirror our neighbors. So I'd like to get the conversation going on those 3 things. And I think the only new thing I'm putting in the mix is the idea of an overlay district that allows for micros in neighborhood business zoned areas and the CBD. So curious what you guys thought.
Commissioner Douglas.
I'm sorry, did Commissioner Macy have her hand up?
Oh, I didn't. You guys could use your icons. It's getting hard for me today if you could maybe try digitally, at least I can, if I miss you then it's a challenge. So we'll go Commissioner Macy, then Commissioner Douglas.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. So I'm just following up with what Commissioner Dubak was saying. I think also at the last meeting that we had, my memory, we had a lot of stakeholders in the room at that time, and we were discussing the plan that we had been creating over the past, however long, year and a half, for this. And there was a lot of concern about the procedure that we were putting in place. And I think we've been really focused on doing this primarily through the zoning ordinance so that we didn't have to do a picking and choosing, that there was no merit system that we could get sued on, because there was so much uncertainty out there. And I think at the last meeting, at least to me, it seemed like we were going to get sued doing it the way that we were trying to do it as well. And there were other flaws in the system that we had created, including, as I can't remember, Commissioner Perush pointed out, that there were 18 potential spots, which if we were picking a number is probably bigger than the number that we would have chosen. And I think Commissioner Dubak has also sort of illuminated this, is that the zoning also has given it a certain area, and perhaps there are other places that this would be an appropriate and good use. And especially right now, given the economic situation, I think there has been a change in how we're going to have to view this. And I think, again, like we're a little behind the ball now, but the good thing about that people keep telling me is that we can use as examples what other cities have done, and have up on my screen the Berkeley merit criteria. And they're great. I mean, I think I'd just steal them right from Berkeley, and then we can all get sued together. But I think what Commissioner Dubak was saying, if we're all implementing the same kind of criteria, then we'll be defending them together and we'll be adjusting them together. It's not like we're saying we're staking our lives on this being the best system in the world, but we're going to try this out and see where the weak points are and continue to improve. So, I mean, I hate to say this. I'm sure Mr. Gillen and Mr. Twing are banging their heads against the wall because this is essentially, I know Commissioner Dubak said it's not much of a change, but it's actually starting from scratch, because what we've done so far is put it together as entirely zoning based. And now we're suggesting, or at least I'm suggesting, that we kind of start fresh and also have this merit application system and set a limit on the number ourselves, like actually set a hard limit that we can adjust later. So I think this is quite a big change that we're suggesting, and will take a lot of work to get this in place. Although again, I'm hoping we can crib a lot of Berkeley's work. But I think Commissioner Dubak is right. We should be talking about what the numbers are and where we're envisioning this happening, and bearing in mind that the situation has changed quite a bit since the last time even that we talked about this a few months ago.
Commissioner Douglas.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on a couple of things here. One is the idea of putting these businesses into the CBD. I think inevitably we'll see business closures in our downtown as the result of the business closures that we have right now. It creates an even greater probability that landlords will sit on vacant properties waiting for marijuana businesses. The staff made a very compelling point on this subject and I have heard anecdotally of this in other communities where they have seen big properties in their downtown sit vacant with the landlord with some patient money waiting to get a marijuana business in there. And I do see that a marijuana business or two might be a pedestrian draw, so you could make that argument, but I still find that the landlord and vacant property scenario is far more compelling to me. I'm still married to the idea of using zoning to affect this. What we did see was that of the 18 possible locations, 11 of them are on Woodward Avenue. And I would make a case. So one of the things in the zoning ordinance is that the amount of parking required is that tied to similar uses. And I would make a case for increasing the amount of parking required. One, because I am concerned that
the industry is going to ramp up slowly, and there would be a substantial period of time when those businesses were underparked, had high demand, and we saw that demand moving into neighborhoods. Furthermore, expanded parking requirement would limit whole stretches of Woodward Avenue because there just is no adjacent parking even for the established businesses, not to mention a larger parking requirement that we might ask for a marijuana establishment. Thirdly, I took kind of a virtual tour up Woodward, thank you Google Maps, the other day. And if you look at the established businesses that you know aren't going anywhere, you know, CVS, a bank, Cornerstone, Trader Joe's, any of the really established businesses there, that greatly limits the number of locations. So while the maximum number on Woodward theoretically is 11, I think the number of actual possible locations are far lower than that. I'm not really concerned about what happens in industrial districts. In fact, the Planning Commission, we like the idea of a grower who also had a retail operation or a processing operation. So it's really Woodward that my attention is focused on. And so I'm going to defend the recommended approach of just using zoning as the objective standard by which we locate those businesses.
Commissioner Perush, did I see your hand?
Yes, you did.
Okay. And then after Commissioner Perush, I have Commissioner Macy and then Commissioner Dubuck.
Let me tell you a little bit about what I found appealing about the way Berkeley is handling it. And Berkeley is handling it the other way. They're handling it by limiting the number to just 3 and by having a very, very detailed set of criteria by which they evaluate the applications. What's appealing to me about that is that there are elements in the criteria that they use which granted could be attacked for their subjectivity, but on the other hand, give us more control over the types of businesses that actually come in and fill out an application and are considered. For example, one of their criteria is that the owner of the property is the same as the owner of the business itself, which limits significantly the number of people that are going to come in terms of fill out an application. They're going to have that kind of financial commitment, not only an ownership in the property, but also an ownership in the business. They talk about inclusion of green infrastructure in the facility. They include sustainability of the operation. A whole lot of other criteria that I don't think we necessarily could include in our own licensing scheme in terms of how we evaluate our own applications. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in our application scheme for our licensing, which is different than the zoning ordinance, we could actually put those criteria in. And if that's the case, I would be more comfortable with it rather than just saying, we'll just accept whoever comes in with a state with a state approved license. But I found the ability of Berkeley to limit the number just to 3 and to have a very detailed 24 at least numerically ranked criteria as to who they give their licenses to, appealing. But I know that it can get attacked for being too subjective, and that's the risk in doing it that way. But it has some appeal to me right now.
Pat, you're in charge right now.
He asked you to chair. He had to step out for a minute, Pat. So you can call on me. He's calling on me.
I don't know who's next.
So I just wanted to say briefly back to respond to Commissioner Douglas about the concern about landlords sitting on the properties. I think we're going to have a flood of applications, and I think the number that we allot is going to fill immediately. I don't think there's going to be like we say 10 and then we're getting 9 and there's 1 open. And if there are already 10 establishments and that's our limit, what use is it for a landlord to sit? They're sitting and waiting for another marijuana business to go out of business so that they can give it to them. Like the cap on the number of locations, I think counteracts the problem you're talking about, where if we didn't set a number and we were just doing the zoning, then for sure they could sit on it. But if we set a number that's specific and then we reach it, there's no point to sit on property.
Commissioner Dubuck? Before you go, Commissioner Dubuck, Mr. Gillum wanted to interject with something.
Well, if Commissioner Dubuck has some other thoughts to add, I was just going to suggest that we open the floor up a little bit and hear what Jessica and Tom might have to say based upon the discussion that they've been hearing up to this point in time. Maybe we should hear from Kyle first. So.
Sure. I think I was going to make the same point as Commissioner Macy, which is that this is different than the argument that's made about liquor licenses, which we used to have some modicum of control over that's been blown open by the state, right? If we have a very limited number of licenses, and on top of that, if it's regulated by zoning, and if we have an overlay district with a setback in the CBD, that now there's 2 ordinances that would have to be changed that currently allow for 1, maybe 2 in the CBD, there is no incentive for a property owner just to sit there and wait for the city to change 2 ordinances. That's a huge hill to climb. So I don't see that as an argument against 1, allowing it in the CBD, or 2, having some criteria based awarding of these licenses. I think it has to be a mix of both the zoning and then a cap, so that we can see the impact on our community and grow from there. But I'm certainly interested in the attorney's take on it.
I'll just, since I haven't had a chance to weigh in, and I appreciate those arguments about, speculation and non-speculation. And I'll just add that even though we haven't come to any decision at this point whatsoever, and we're still in the design phase, there's a lot of folks on Woodward already that have, got deep pockets and they've tied up properties. I can tell you that firsthand because they all try to call me and email me and talk to me. And so while I understand the logic that folks have, you're not talking about necessarily a financially driven decision here. You're talking about an opportunity driven decision. And when you have lots of money in deep pockets and your building's paid off, and you have right now a situation in our downtown where, folks can't pay their rents, they're struggling, they have issues. This might be the straw on the camel's back to force some of those folks out as opposed to helping them. I don't see any reason why down the road we can't update the zoning through 1 vote, maybe 2, with how the ordinance works, to open it up to the downtown once all of this COVID-19 stuff shakes out, once we see what our retail and what our restaurant environment looks like, and once we hear more from the players right now in our downtown area, I don't see the urgency to do it at this point, especially when we didn't get an overwhelmingly supportive, survey for the downtown. We talk about pluralities, but it wasn't like 70% of the people said, let's do it in our downtown. So I understand the point. I think at some point in time we can go there and we'll have that. I just don't think, I think the risk is too high. And I think we could probably work within a planning formula and perhaps even a cap that comes with some criteria. I think we all say 18 is too much. Mr. Douglas says, well, it's probably not 18, 11 on Woodward, which is probably smaller, and I agree with her. But if it's really a number we want to start, or if it's a sequence where we do 2 a year, whatever it may be, I think that's an important thing for us to kind of start from. We can always change it, but you can never go back. And so our downtown happens to be the most valuable economic contributor in our community as far as our identity is concerned, our home values are concerned. It's something that we all love and enjoy. And while I see a place for this eventually in our downtown, I don't know, if we come out of the gate, full horses with so much uncertainty in the downtown right now as we speak. My thoughts. So we'll see. Ms. Wood, Mr. Forshee, anything that you heard tonight that seems hyper illegal, unconstitutional, or unconscionable that you can with?
Not at all. This is a familiar discussion that you're having. And just so you know, we've done it a number of different ways in different communities. That being said, generally speaking, and Tom, chime in as you wish, we recommend that you have both a police or regulatory ordinance in place and a zoning ordinance in place for a couple different reasons. First of all, your police or regulatory ordinance is the one that's going to contain sort of the nuts and bolts of the licensing process, including your right to inspect, your right to revoke, your right to collect that up to $5,000 a year annually for your administrative costs. Those things fit naturally and much more legally within a police or regulatory ordinance. So you should have that no matter how short it is. You need a police ordinance. But then you also need a zoning ordinance, because you can't have zoning ordinance elements within a regulatory license, or it could be held invalid. So you really need both. In terms of limiting the number of operations that you allow, and it sounds like you're all well aware of this, but there's two ways to do that. There's just using zoning to do it, and I call that the natural selection method, because really, once you start adding buffers and other limitations, and you've got a lot of leeway to do that, you really can start to narrow down the number sort of through natural selection using zoning. But the other way, which is also perfectly legitimate, is by using the competitive process in your regulatory ordinance. And as you're all well aware, it sounds like, though, there's inevitably a degree of subjectivity in doing so. Now, it's hard to say whether that's really going to involve any more risk in terms of legal challenges than the other way. Frankly, you might get sued no matter what. That's not to say that the person suing you is going to win, however. When you do decide, though, to put a cap on the number that you're going to allow, the statute requires you to make the decision, and this is the tricky part. You have to decide then which of these applicants are best suited to operate in compliance with the law. Now, what does that mean, right? But we've really looked at this, and we've drafted some competitive processes, and we have those criteria. And I don't know, Tom, if you want to, you were sort of the brainchild behind those, if you want to go through those and mention some examples of what those might look like if you were to go that route.
Sure. Yeah, and I understand that it feels uncomfortable when you're essentially picking winners subjectively from a list. It all kind of goes against our nature to do that. This is strange that the state law is telling us that if you do a cap, then you must do those subjective findings. So what we tried to do was come up with a list that was objective as possible. And we'd be happy to look at other, it sounds like there's something in Berkeley that might have some criteria also that could be looked at. We came up with, for some other clients, some criteria that we thought made sense. And then ultimately you keep coming back to that, which one is best suited to operate in compliance with the act. So it's almost kind of like a who's most likely to succeed type endeavor. But we came up with what we thought were some good objective criteria to the extent they could be. We also didn't do a numbering ranking system necessarily. That could be discussed, but what we kind of thought was you take those criteria, kind of like in a planning commission context, you take all the special land use criteria together, and then you come to a conclusion about which one has the most, was most likely to succeed, best suited to operate in compliance with the act. So some of the items that we've used, and forgive me, I'm just going to scroll. I'm going to scroll through a document that I have here, and try to look as well. So again, it's taking a look at the application, the plans, how they're going to handle security, lighting, processing, handling of hazardous waste, site plans, record keeping, disposal, water and utility, ventilation and odor, which would demonstrate likely success. If they don't have some of these criteria, if they don't have some of these things in place, they're probably going to be, it's going to be harder for them to succeed. Or if they don't have a plan for these things. Another criteria was whether the applicant is currently in default on any taxes or fees otherwise due to the city, or a history of non-compliance or violations with other city ordinances, or has been served with any complaint or notice filed from other public bodies, federal, state, or local, that might tend to show whether they are the best suited. Another one was whether the applicant is a business operating in the city within the past 2 years, demonstrating a commitment to doing business in the city, contributing, and these are getting a little subjective, but contributing to helping the city grow and succeed in a manner harmonious for all residents and property types. Whether the applicant has a history of criminal convictions, except for those that the statute says you can't look at. Whether the applicant has ever applied for, has been granted any commercial license or certificate issued by a licensing authority in Michigan. So looking at some of their other business dealings, whether they've had other licenses denied, restricted, suspended, things like that. Whether they've been involved in bankruptcies. We had in this other one, it sounds like we're not going to getting into medical. One of the other criteria we've thrown out there is if they've already have a medical facility, then they would be probably more likely to succeed in a recreational manner, but that one won't apply to you. And, it's a short list, I think, but it goes through kind of the criteria of what someone would need to succeed, to tick all those boxes about how they're going to handle waste, how they're going to handle security, all those things that are going to be important to the city. And then ultimately making the decision about who to choose. And what we suggested was opening up a window. So there'd be a window of time when everybody, and it would be made known by city manager, between these two dates, get your applications in. And then once the window closes, then that will be the short list of people that are chosen for each spot. So it does avoid some of the race to the city hall questions. And if they get through that initial application period, then their application would be forwarded to the zoning administrator and to any other departments that would need it, like police or fire, anybody who needs to do an inspection. And we'll go through the zoning process. So you'd have this licensing process, and it can be, as Jessica said, as complicated as you want to be. It can have the cap in there, or it could just be a licensing that doesn't have a cap. But we do suggest having both a police and a zoning ordinance working in conjunction. And then basically, the question of how many is really a policy question. And we can make it work however you choose to do it, whether that is a cap and zoning, or whether it's just zoning and purely doing it that way. There is legal risk either way, just based on the statute. Is many unclear points. There's not been a lot of litigation yet on all these points. So what our goal would be is to take input about what you want to see happen, the number you want to see, and make that happen for you with the least amount of legal risk that can possibly be had under those circumstances. And you're never going to eliminate it all, but that's what we would aim to do.
Hey, Tom, just a couple quick questions, and I got Commissioner Macy and Commissioner Perush that I saw. So I heard the sort of the criteria there, and some of it seemed, familiar to things that we look at in terms of a plan of operation for, liquor licensed establishments, and some almost seemed like eligibility criteria. Can you talk a little bit to the difference between, okay, hey, I'm not gonna, what do we do? Evaluate like, oh, this guy's got one bankruptcy and this guy's got 3. Let's go with this guy. You know what I mean? Or is it, hey, if you had any of these things, you can apply, but it's going to be kicked back right away because you're not eligible. And then you narrow the field down to, those that are eligible. And then you can really take a shake at, those particular applicants. And then it seemed, and I've heard, I think from our last meeting, that the criteria we have to look at is really just a criteria that supplements perhaps what the state already requires. And that some of the things, maybe some of the things that Berkeley did, like if you want to require that, green infrastructure, okay, or you want to require that, it's a locally owned major corporate, that the people are going to reside, they can't own more than 2 or 3, whatever it may be. That those things aren't necessarily included in the state statute as far as licensing is concerned. And therefore, we've been, at least maybe I dreamed this, it's been a while, but that type of criteria is a little bit off limits. Can you talk a little bit to those two elements?
Sure. So I think as far as drawing a hard line that if you've had a bankruptcy, you're out, probably has more legal risk, I would say, than letting, during the open window, anybody who wants to apply applies, and then you have your set criteria, and you look at all the, so someone may have had a bankruptcy, but you may find that the other factors are so overwhelmingly good, it was such a fluke, it could be explained to your to your satisfaction, that that you'd rank them, you wouldn't eliminate them outright. I think if you eliminated outright based on one factor, that would probably be a little more legally risky than allowing the applications to come in, evaluating them as a whole. You don't necessarily need to point to any one criteria, but you're just taking all those totality of the circumstances type analysis there, going through all those criteria. Where do you rank in the window?
So not a formula, rather, but similar to what we do in planning. Is this for the betterment of the community, whatever it may be? And then
sort of. It's not like a zoning board of appeals where you're like, if you miss one category, you're out. This is more of the planning commission, special land use. This is just a shorthand, but yeah, taking all those factors into account and then coming to a conclusion ultimately about who is most likely to succeed. So I think that dovetailed into your second question. What was that? Did that answer the
second question? Is just more or less that criteria was very objective and specific and seemed very relevant to the state statute, the state license. Are we allowed to use other things that the state really doesn't, comprehend in their licensing?
If I could just weigh in here for a second, you're absolutely right, Mayor. There's an overlap between these criteria, which we tried to make as objective as possible, and what some might just consider eligibility, right? Just black and white eligibility. These are not particularly interesting criteria for sure. And the ones you mentioned by example, like requiring the applicant to provide green infrastructure and giving local preference, those types of things, frankly, are where you get into more legal risk. So they're not directly connected, if I could speculate here, to the permission being sought. Let me just put it that way. So the more disconnected the thing is that you're requiring from the actual permit being sought or the use being sought, the riskier it is from a legal standpoint. And that's why, even though the list of criteria that Tom went through seems sort of dry and boring, that there's a reason for that. I don't know. Right? I mean, Tom, do you agree? I mean, the more you get into, and we also want you to do affordable housing, and we want, you got to be careful with that stuff.
You're ultimately going back to which one's most likely to succeed, and does having green infrastructure indicate, maybe it does, but maybe it doesn't. Does it indicate to you about the level of success that this place is going to have in complying with the act? And so, that's just the art of it. And they were pretty dry. That was sort of the aim though, which was to make them as objective as possible. Even though there's going to be subjectivity to it no matter what. But
so Tom, under your constellation, the scenario that could work out, and Jessica, is that, okay, we'd have a zoning ordinance that would really decide where, like on Woodward and these general business districts, downtown, whatever we come up with as a commission, okay, you have that. You have some things in there related to distance, 1,000 feet apart and whatever. So now we get to this maximum of 18, whatever in the city, or that, you know, is hypothetical at best, but, you know, there is a potential for 18. And then let's say, okay, the commission, we want to put a cap on it, at least to start, to kind of get our feet wet, see where the market goes, you know, avoid over speculation in our community. Okay, we say, we pick a number, 5, 3, 10, whatever it may be. So we pick that number, and now these people, they apply during a window. And we have this really objective criteria that's relevant and germane to running a successful operation. And we would sit back with some process, whether that's the commission or we appoint a board or it's staff, whatever is, you know, we decide to go through that licensing ordinance. Okay, well, let's look at these. Okay, this particular applicant has a bankruptcy. This particular applicant has no cash flow. This particular applicant has a criminal. And then we just say, okay, we looked at all the applications and these are the 5 we're going with. And we don't necessarily have to create like a Supreme Court opinion on all of these or provide a checkbox, but we can say, look, we looked at the criteria and this is what shook out. And that debate would be open to the public or whatever. And then those folks would get their applications approved for wherever parcels of land that they would, you know, want to, you know, have their operation. Is that in a very long, expressive nutshell, what you're focused on with that, what you've done with other cities with that criteria?
The only thing you just said that alarmed me was the part about it would shake out in the public. You don't want to, you know, I don't know if you meant that, but like you can't have a public hearing about every single license. That would be.
No, I was thinking more or less when we would have to have, so my question, maybe that's another question too. And I'm sorry, I'm going to get to you, Melanie and Pat. My question, it's another good question because we're used and we promote transparency in this community. And so if we're going through the application process, maybe I'm jumping the gun here a little bit. What does that look like? Is that just a bunch of, you know, folks in the back room with cigars and, you know, pool tables? Or is it, you know, we go like the planning board and, you know, because you can't review one up and down. I agree, at least out of the gate. So is that something that we sit in a workshop and it's televised and public and we discuss and then or is it something that we do in closed session? I would think that would be weird because people should know what our decision-making process is. Can you elaborate on that, and then I'll shut up, and then we'll go to Commissioner Macy and Commissioner Prush.
In some communities, we've had the city manager, and so I'm sure Dave loves the sound of doing that. But yeah, I guess
Thursday. Yeah, thank you. So.
Yeah, yeah. It's not trying to hide, but you also don't want to put an administrative burden on yourself where you're slowing the applications down so much that, you know, it kind of grinds everything to a halt. So I think that. Well,
and also you want to make sure that you're not arbitrarily applying your criteria. And so you've got to nail down your criteria and apply them exactly the same way to every single applicant for fairness and uniformity. And so you really do have to either assign it to staff, you know, a staff member, or have a committee that does it uniformly. So that's the risk in having too much public input in whether to allow a license. So, and now I'll shut up. But
yeah, that's one of the reasons we kind of took off the giving a score to each criteria. We just thought, you know, that's going to invite, well, why did I get a 3? You know, if it's 0 to 5, why did I get a 4 and not a 3? You know, or why, you know, it would be second guessed at every stage. So again, that's why we kind of went to this totality of all of them together, where maybe not one thing was the deciding factor, but as a whole, that decision was made. But yeah, as far as just being uniform in the way you look at them, someone's going to have to make the call. It's not a comfortable place to be. We understand that.
And you're issuing a business license. So just like any other business license in your community, you're issuing a business license. I don't know if your city manager does that or how you do it, but it should be that, you know, uniformly administrated.
Okay. Commissioner Macy.
So for some of the criteria, and of course I understand that the more subjective or the less tied it is directly to the actual operation of the business, the more likely it is that there could be a legal issue. But in our past discussions about this, there have been some talk about community benefit and how that can play into some of these criteria. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Question.
So there are communities who are using, I wouldn't call them community benefit agreements so much, but voluntary equitable development agreement type models where the applicants have the opportunity to essentially voluntarily provide some of these things in order to get more points, or depending on how the process works that they've set forth, in order to get ahead in the queue in terms of processing their license where they're competing for limited spots. So yeah, there are people doing it. The key there is that the applicant is doing those things voluntarily. And I don't know, I guess I can live with those as long as, again, there's some sort of rational relationship between the things being, on the list that you could pick from to sort of volunteer to do to get more points, and the actual permission being granted. Now, I think, Tom, you take a more conservative view about these things. I don't know, but what are your thoughts? I mean, I've certainly seen those lists, to answer your question, yes. And they can get points by volunteering to either do green infrastructure or any number of things for the community.
Yeah, I probably am more conservative on that topic. I think that even if it is allowable, it's definitely more risky, has more risk, because you're introducing some other criteria that start to stray away from that core question that you're supposed to be asking. So you just have to be, I think it can be done, but we just have to be very careful in crafting those criteria. In a sense, they're voluntary because they're saying, here's what we're bringing to the table. And we're not saying we're going to deny you a permit if you don't bring those things to the table. We're saying if you bring those things to the table, when we look at you in total, you may move up the ladder as far as when your application will be considered. And as you know, once this goes to zoning and one person gets a place, automatically a circle goes around that, eliminating in a buffer. So coming in first does sometimes either eliminate someone else completely, or it restricts them. So, but yeah, we have done those kind of voluntary offered conditions, and communities have used those. Those are not quite as objective as some of those drier criteria that we talked about earlier, though.
Yeah, although I'm still looking at the Berkeley ordinance. It looks like the way that they're doing it is about as objective as you can make such a thing. And it does also seem to address the point that you're talking about scoring them 5 versus a 4. It looks like you get a certain number of points, like just yes or no. Like, have you done this? Yes, you get the points. If you've not done this, no, you don't get the points. And it has it for the entire list, with some of the factors rated more heavily. And then it seems like there's a 70% cutoff. So if you get 70% of the points, then will be in consideration, and then they'll be viewed from there. But just to me, it looks like a pretty good and interesting system. You did just make me think of another question I had, though, about this buffer, like the 1,000-foot buffer between that we're proposing. Is that something that you've been doing elsewhere?
Yeah, we've done buffers between facilities, similar facilities, and some of those more sensitive uses. So yeah, those buffers we've built those in. I think we've built them into both zoning and regulatory ordinances.
Right. And you can get quite creative with your buffers depending on how much you want to influence the number that you allow. You can, as somebody mentioned, you can put buffers between existing businesses. You can reduce the buffer from schools. some people are getting, creating church buffers. I mean, there's a number of different ways to go about including buffers. My only suggestion would be to make sure that you have a good rationale for whatever buffers you come up with.
That's a trick to all of it, right?
Right. Be able to explain yourself.
Right. And then, so not a question just for the other commissioners. I think it was mentioned that we had decided not to consider medical, and that was pretty much agreed at the last one. Immediately after that meeting, I'm not sure about the rest of you, but I got contacted by several people who were saying, actually, for people who have a medical need, it's cheaper or easier to get it from these medical than it is from the recreational, and so it would be, in fact, be a benefit to some of our residents who have a actual medical need. So I know we've kind of put it off the table, and I just wanted to throw that out there as a reason, I think, to consider it again.
If I could interject one more time to your point about the medical, we've been hearing that a lot as well, Commissioner. And the other thing is, if you have a medical license, you move up a lot more quickly in the state's licensing process, like significantly more quickly. So if you have a medical license, you are addressed much more quickly to get your recreational approval at the state level. So the argument has been made that for applicants trying to get into municipalities who don't have the medical option, they fall way behind in the queue at the state. So just so you know, that's another thing that keeps coming up when considering whether to do both.
Commissioner Parish. Hey, Commissioner Parish, can you unmute? You might have a sticky button there.
I always forget that. Sorry about that. Back to the issue of the zoning and the locations where they would be located in Royal Oak if we were to adopt this zoning ordinance. And it would be just general business and industrial, which would be the Woodward corridor and the area around Meyer, and then the industrial areas, such as they are. We heard last time in comments from some of the actual people who are in the industry that given the high cost of rental and property along the Woodward corridor and also in the industrial area, that it really would preclude a number of the more local, smaller businesses from actually operating within the city, just because there wouldn't be available, affordable property. If we were to instead focus on a number and a criteria system, I think we might be able to open that up to other zoning categories where you might have property that would be more affordable. Like if you opened it up to the neighborhood business area or to one of the other business zoning categories, but only had a limited number of licenses in the city, let's say 5. You wouldn't have a proliferation of them within the rest of the city areas. But on the other hand, you might make other more locally owned, perhaps, as opposed to the big national players, an opportunity to actually have a business because the property would be more affordable. That's just one point. The second thing, back to Berkeley, they are doing a window. Today is their first day of their 14-day window where they're accepting applications. Their criteria system has a point system to it. It's a merit point. Each criteria has maybe a maximum of 20 points or 25 points or whatever, and they rank each of the applicants and give them a number of points. To me, that makes their system even more subjective than the notion of categories and criteria. But that's how they're doing it. They're actually adopting a point system. And then adding them up, and whoever's the top 3 points, those are the people that get the licenses. And they are having their applications reviewed by their plan commission, and that's the plan commission that's going to be delegating the various points to the various applicants. So my guess is that if it's the full plan commission, that's going to be a public meeting. It doesn't sound like they're adopting any kind of committee. And I think that to the extent that you talked about the danger of opening it up to public and public pressure, by having it a full open public process, I think that that's possibly a danger in their system. So I agree that if you had an administrative or administrative committee reviewing the applications, it might resolve that element of risk a little bit. So anyway, that's what I wanted to add right now.
Anybody else? Oh, Commissioner Douglas.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm looking at the Berkeley document in front of me here, and they've got a number of criteria which are really pass-fail criteria with points attached to them. For example, proposed redevelopment is located in one of the following areas, and then they list the zoning categories where it would be permitted, and then they give a point score to that, which makes me wonder, well, if my project isn't in one of those areas, why are you considering it at all? So, I mean, I see several items in their draft that that are really objective. It's either, A or B. So I'll ask, I guess, Mr. Gillum or the other attorneys on the subject. We have a draft adult use ordinance that we've considered up until now. And it seems like a lot of the criteria that are in there are what Mr. Forshee described earlier. Very active in terms of ownership, criminal backgrounds, site designs, and so forth. Is that what, how does what we're talking about now, if at all, differ from what we've already seen? Mr. Gillum, Mr. Forshee.
I can't tell if Tom is frozen or not. I have not seen, I don't have that criteria in front of me, so I don't know that I can speak to that. Is that in a zoning ordinance that you're referring to? Or
no,
a draft regulatory?
Draft regulatory.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it gets back to what Tom is talking about is what you've seen before. Again, getting back to an applicant's ability to comply with the ordinance, which is really the acid test. That's the standard that you have to use in evaluating different applicants. So the other things you're talking about, again, are getting a little bit away from that and into a more subjective area.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking that, just because something is yes or no doesn't necessarily make the criteria that you're evaluating them against legitimate. I haven't seen the Berkeley one yet. I'll definitely take a look at that to see if they have some criteria that makes sense. But there could be criteria that is so far away from coming back to that statutory language, which says the one that's most likely to be able to comply with the act and most likely to succeed might get so far away from that even though it's a yes and no question, it's still not really a fair game question that would cause you to make a decision one way or another. So I think we just have to be careful about that. Some people do choose to do a point system. Some people don't. That's sort of more of a policy call. I kind of come out on the don't score it because you're going to get people complaining about not getting a score. And then, it's going to be more fun to say that all the criteria, and I made a decision that was in line with what the statute required me to do. And based on all these criteria, I made a decision on this particular criteria. And, someone I should have gotten 3 in that criteria. And so that's just how I come down on it. But, it could be done in different ways.
I agree with Tom in that regard. I think it's going to be a lot harder to defend a 4 versus a 3 instead of just putting it all together in sort of a potpourri of a decision-making process and being able to go back to that standard every time we felt that they were best suited to operate in compliance with the act without having to defend specific calculations. So that's why we sort of tend to suggest that you stay away from the point system. And then a couple of you have noticed that our competitive selection process seems or sounds an awful lot like just eligibility standards. And that was intentional, and there is some overlap there, but I'm not sure why a lot of your eligibility standards, like complete application and, you know, a good security plan and lighting, and whether you're in arrears on any of your taxes, that is a competitive process as far as we're concerned. So you're satisfying this competitive process requirement when you use caps. And it's also just, yes, at the end of the day, these are also just eligibility requirements. So really, there's a lot of overlap there.
And I would agree, I think, with Tom and Jessica, too. I'm not crazy about the point system, the scoring system. I'd qualify that, though, too, because then it's going to put a burden on whether it's the city commission or whoever it is that ultimately makes the final decision to make an appropriate record as to exactly what their decision is and why they're making it. I mean, we're talking about the decisions that a planning commission makes, and maybe in granting special land use approval, some findings that you have to make, and the evidence that you've received. It's going to be the same thing. The devil's going to be in the details. When we're making licensing decisions, we're going to have to establish an appropriate record to support our decision if we're challenged down the road.
So continuing with my questions, if we eliminate the point system, and I share the attorney's concerns about that method, it leaves us with two other possibilities. One is, you know, first in, first out, which has its own, you know, fraught possibilities. And the other is a drawing. I mean, that is, if you've got standards and the applicants have all met the standards, then, you know, if you've set a cap, and the cap is 5, then you draw out 5 randomly, and those are your winners. What sayest thou to that?
We have incorporated that into some of the ordinances that we've worked on.
The draw?
Like you said, after you meet all of the criteria, you're in a hat, and it's a drawing process. And
I think that one was without the I think the drawing one was without the cap, correct? So that was just from a zoning perspective, first one in, first one out.
Right. That's right.
If I recall.
But we have incorporated that into one of the processes. Yep, and actually drew the names out of the hat publicly.
And Mr. Portucci, I'm sorry, how do you...
If you go to the cap, yeah. I was just saying, if you're going to the cap where you are doing a straight up, you know, ranking, you know, there is some subjectivity to it. So I think to the best of your ability, you would try to rank them, unless you just absolutely cannot come to consensus as to the rank. If you're doing the competitive process, because you want it to look competitive, and if you go to just a random draw, it might tend to say, well, is the random draw going to pick someone more likely to succeed or not? It did go through a competitive process. So you did go through the competitive process, but at the end, you're sort of veering away from the competitive process, doing sort of a random thing. So I guess my advice on that would probably be, to the extent you can rank them, and there is some objectivity, maybe someone's security plan is better than someone else's. Maybe someone's, for that, some are very yes, no, like, have you had bankruptcies? But some are, you know, what's your application look like? Is it complete? Does it give me enough detail where I can know that you're going to succeed? What do you do with your waste? Maybe you're better suited to getting rid of it in a better way than the other. So I guess I would just try to, if you can rank them at all possible, do that, because then you stay in that kind of competitive process lane. And then, you know, if it can't be done, then you kind of resort to those more like a random draw, which some communities have done that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We had a question from public comment about flippers. And I think that, you know, most communities look at this as a opportunity, to the extent that it's an economic opportunity, clearly, the homegrown folks should get priorities, and that when we're looking at these applications and we make a decision and then the next day it's flipped, I mean, that kind of defeats the entire application process, and going through all that rigmarole if someone can just, sell out to a big tobacco company, for example. So how does that work? And how do you address that concern with flipping?
So, and Tom, chime in here too, but you can set that up in your licensing procedure so that that can't occur, so that the applicant is actually the one who holds the license, and then it doesn't get transferred to someone you've never met before the next day. I mean, that can be dealt with in your ordinance.
So there's no prohibitions where we can put restrictions on that essentially the license resides with the person or the particular business, if it's a partnership or something like that. And then if they choose to sell their business, just like with the liquor license ordinances, we have to approve the new plan of operation, the new applicants, et cetera. Okay. So there is, in the ordinance, we can put those provisions. Got it.
Yeah. And there's some, there could be gradations of that, of like how someone may transfer. If you wanted to allow for transfers, you could do it on a limited, where you would look at their application and sort of make them go through the application process again. But
Right.
yeah, so you could set it up as either no transfers or, and then you just have to be careful too, as far as zoning goes, once the use has been approved on that property, then that runs with the land. So from a zoning perspective, the use would be there. It would just be who holds the license, and you could say, right, no, sorry, the license isn't transferable. So,
right.
Although it's zoned to be that, no one's eligible.
All the more reason to do your police ordinance as well, because that's where you get your control over the license.
Yep.
Separate and apart from the use approval, like Tom just mentioned. So that can all be dealt with in your regulatory ordinance to make sure that doesn't happen.
So a little bit of a point of order here right now. We've been in here for an hour and a half. Had a lot of discussion, a lot of information exchanged. Mr. Gillum, I mean, I know maybe a little bit more about the objective of the work session. Is it the intent that the commissioners learn more here, or is it more to kind of give you a sense of what you need to bring back to the commission as far as a potential zoning and licensing ordinance?
Well, I think ideally we'd be looking for some direction from the commission based upon the discussion as to what you might like to see in an ordinance that we would bring back. I mean, if we need to have more discussion, or if you're not prepared to provide that direction, if you need more information, then we can get that for you, and we could have this kind of discussion on another night. So.
Well, what I'd like to do, I see your hand, Commissioner Dubuck, just one second. What I'd like to do, if the commission is okay with it, is I kind of got a sense, at least from the people that have made a comment, about maybe some common ground. And if we can kind of clear those off the table to say, yep, we're good with this, then we can maybe focus on some of the finer points that, consider some debate. I think we're still not completely, although we agree on certain areas, there might be one or two areas that we disagree on. Maybe the first thing I can see is, is there any strong objections from anybody about having both a licensing ordinance and a zoning ordinance for the reasons that we talked about tonight so far? Commissioner Perush?
It was my impression from the beginning that we all understood that we absolutely had to have both. No matter what kind of zoning structure we establish, we have to have an ordinance to license businesses if we want businesses in the community, and that's got to be separate from a land use ordinance. So I think we're all operating from that position, that there's no question that we have to have both. What the licensing ordinance includes, whether it's, the criteria, the scoring system, all of that kind of stuff as to who gets the license is one question. But I think it goes without saying that we have the authority to license each and every business that comes into the community, and it's got to be in the ordinance form, and it can't be in the zoning ordinance. So it was my impression that it kind of goes without saying that we had to have both, and that the staff was already working on both.
I was hoping to get an easy yes from everyone to start the baseline. Commissioner Perush is right, and I don't see any objectives. So now we break it out into really two categories. You know, the where, the how many, and what are we going to do to evaluate these applications? Maybe on the where side, okay, what I see, there's some debate about whether or not we allow this in our central business district or not. Okay, if we carve that debate out for a second, is there any strong objection to what's been, at least to the areas that have been presented to us right now, which is general business, industrial, 1,000 feet, things of that nature, and then we can talk about potential overlays in other areas in the central business district separately. Commissioner Douglas. Oh, you actually muted yourself instead of unmuting yourself.
All right. If you look at the zoning map and you look at the 1,000-foot radius around schools, for sure, at least schools, and you look at the zoning map, there's only a very small area of the CBD that would even be eligible. And among those properties are the farmer's market, the library, the post office, and the train station. So even if you allow it in the CBD, it's not going to be the driving retail establishment in the heart of Main Street that that some people might want. So the CBD is kind of off the table at this point, or rather a moot point.
Yeah. Or when we put it on the table for the strong objection conversation, we can talk about that. So just for the way everything is right now as presented, those areas identified, does anyone have an issue with the general business district on Woodward or the other areas as they're listed? And then, I think Commissioner Douglas makes a good point about the central business district. But that aside, then we'll talk about that next. Commissioner Macy.
So I don't know that this is, I would term it a strong objection, but I have never quite been on board with the 1,000-foot distance between retailers. It seems to me if two are right next to each other, maybe that's all for the best. But I'm not taking some huge stand on that. That's just throwing that out there since you asked. Also, I guess I understood that for the CBD, we were talking about some overlay districts, but again, we'll talk about that next.
Okay, I don't see, you know what? And I promised that I would go to Commissioner Dubak, and I am so sorry, Commissioner Dubak, because I started going down this questioning and I have you on my note here and I forgot to call on you. Commissioner Dubak, sorry.
We can continue on this train of thought if you like, if you want to go one by one on these issues.
Yeah, I just want to sort them out, so we can use our time very wisely tonight with our experts.
So what is the thing you're feeling out right now? Like zoning, a mix of zoning and selection criteria with a limit, right? Is that what?
Yeah. So what we've determined already, and we kind of determined this before, is that we're going to have a licensing ordinance and a zoning ordinance. Now, the next question I asked was, okay, we have a zoning map presented to us by staff. It currently does not include the central business district, and let's have a debate about that in a few minutes. But everything else that's there, included in there, are we cool, or at least reasonably cool with at the moment to allow, some sort of progress to be made on city staff side to start? If we have to tweak it to 900 feet or 800 feet, we can do that at the table. But at least the work that they're going to put in, as a basic, again, I'm not asking for nitpicking things, but strong objections to the map that's been provided and the things that are in it, and then we'll talk about CBD and overlays. Commissioner Dubak.
Well, I would say, particularly Commissioner Macy raising that, she thinks the setback is too much. I would think that we'd want staff to put some time into, we kind of have a rough number of if we were to maximize the zoning as it currently is with 1,000-foot setback, or somewhere in the 18-19 range. If we didn't have a licensing ordinance, it would be good to know what is that at 500, what is it at 800. So to inform our next discussion, so we're not having to have the same conversation again.
I believe we were provided with some of that information early on as far as, what that would look like. It really doesn't change the map. It just changes the number. I guess it would change a little bit. Some of the folks in the general business district getting closer to schools or whatever within 1,000 feet. But I think we looked at a 500-foot map and a 1,000-foot map, if I'm not mistaken. But at some point, we can, if that's more information that we need. But I mean, just in general, for industrial and general business, we're okay with as a team here. No strong.
Well, and I, like you said, I want to be efficient with our time, and I really want to hit this August 15th deadline. We've punted on this 3 times now. By the time we get this up and running, it's going to have been 2 years since the vote. Many other communities are already up and running. So I don't want to invent more questions. I want to start getting to the point where we're making decisions.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do, Commissioner Dubuck. Commissioner Douglas.
Well, if we're interested, and it seems like we are, or some of us are, in limiting the quantity of businesses, then the 1,000-foot radius does that for us to at least some degree, and makes our more selective processes a little bit more easier and more compact.
And down the road, you can choose to pull that lever 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, and open up, very objectively, X number of more licenses if you want, if things are going swimmingly well, or in combination with a cap and, reducing the amount of feet. I mean, we can learn from this. If we want to put something in place, I guess maybe even the most basic question is, what I thought that we had agreed on, at least what I felt people were feeling since we started this was we start a little bit more conservative. And then as time goes on, we, see what the market's doing around us. We see how these businesses are behaving in our community, the traffic impacts, everything else that, we work. And as they start to settle down and we learn and know more, then we start to ease up on the zoning. We start to ease up on the, distance from each other. We start to ease up on the cap if there's a cap. And that was my, at least, perception talking to all of you, in the public forums. But if it's changed and someone has a strong objection to that overall overarching, strategy, then maybe this is the time to speak up. Commissioner Macy.
Not to what you just said, but just back to Commissioner Douglas, who I absolutely agree with what you said, but draw the opposite conclusion. I think that we should be placing a cap for the reasons that the mayor just stated right at the beginning. And I think for that reason, once we set a cap, having the 1,000-foot distance is not, there's no point to it. So Commissioner Douglas is saying, oh, we have the 1,000-foot distance, we don't need a cap. And I'm saying we should put a cap in, and then we don't need the 1,000-foot distance. I guess I don't see other than a cap.
Quick question, Commissioner Macy, the 1,000-foot distance between the establishments, not necessarily between a school and an establishment.
Right. I'm not talking about the schools. I'm talking about between establishments. So I guess I still have never understood the reason to have the 1,000-foot distance, but for that idea of limiting the number. And if we're not using it to limit the number, I don't understand why we have it. And maybe there's a reason, but it's not in my brain.
Okay. So let's start with that question right now. I mean, does it make sense to have, if we're going to put a cap, and maybe that's the next question, does anyone have a strong objection to putting a cap, or are folks really, want to use complete zoning to do this? I sense that there is a tolerance, maybe other than Commissioner Douglas. Maybe I'm speaking wrong, but she's been the one that really is saying, let's just use zoning. But I feel like some of the others here, don't have an issue putting a cap in place. Maybe I'm wrong. Can you guys enlighten the group about your thoughts on that? Commissioner Prush.
I'm comfortable putting a cap. If I had to pick a number, I would pick 5 or 6. As long as the criteria are refined as carefully as we can, as the way Tom described them, so that it is as objective as possible.
The potpourri approach, objectively potpourri.
Yes, objectively potpourri, or however you want to characterize it. And I would be comfortable with that. And I would be more comfortable with that than just let the zoning world kind of control it. To me, I'm more comfortable with more direct control by saying, 5. That's it. Just 5.
All right, 5 what?
5 recreational.
Any total industrial, manufacturing, retail, any category there?
I would eliminate the categories that we've already eliminated. I don't think that as we've drafted it now, there are certain categories that we've eliminated. Maybe I'm thinking, no, maybe not. Maybe I'm thinking of the things that we've eliminated, like the special events and all those kinds of special licenses. But the other 6 categories, I would let it be open to whoever applies and whatever they apply for.
And what about the 1,000-foot distance with a cap? How do you feel about that, Commissioner Poosh?
I would be willing to reduce it, maybe to 750 feet, 600 feet. I think 1,000 feet is maybe a little, given the way our community is, with the way the land use patterns are, I think maybe 1,000 feet is maybe a little too much.
I think there is some logic to what Commissioner Macy's saying, because, I mean, look, I'm trying to speak as what, I mean, some people aren't going to like this near their businesses or near their homes, if it happens, even if it's 10,000 feet away. But if you cluster them together, you just have one issue, right? If all 5 of them decided to locate in one area in Woodward, then you've impacted everybody the same, in that particular, versus one in the north, one in the south, one over here, spreading them out, you may get the unsettledness in the neighborhoods early on, which I don't think is going to be a real issue in the long run, but just in the short run, there are people that are uncomfortable with it. I get it.
Yep. The other thing that I would be comfortable with is expanding the zoning categories where they would be permitted into like one of the neighborhood business zones, so that you would get into those areas of the city where the value of the property and the cost of the actual property is less than it is along Woodward or in their industrial areas. And I think if we have an actual cap, if we go that route, that means we have some control over how many actually go out into those areas. But at least it gives, I think, some other potential businesses some opportunities.
Yeah, I'm more likely to support broader zoning if we have a hard cap in. My opinion. Let's see. I saw Commissioner DeBuck. Mr. Gillum.
Just a general comment. I don't want to overcomplicate the analysis, but again, remember we have 6 different types of licenses potentially, and we don't have to treat each class of license exactly the same. We can have different caps for different kinds of licenses, and we can have different zoning for different kinds of licenses as well. So for example, the grower licenses, if we want, we can restrict those to the industrial areas on the north end, and that would be probably a logical fit. The retailer licenses, maybe you want to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of where they're going to go. And again, I'm not trying to muddy the water, but again, we don't have to have a one size fits all here for each of the different classes of license.
That's a really good point, Mr. Gillum. Commissioner DeBuck.
Yeah, the only classification I think we want to start with a cap and then grow slowly from there is with the retail licenses. The other types I think can just be restricted by zoning, as Mr. Gillum stated. So I'm definitely happy with the concept of having both zoning and a licensing system with a cap that we grow from. But I do think, which I think you're going to bring up next, we need to talk about an overlay district for micros.
We haven't heard from Commissioner Gibbs or Commissioner Levasseur in a while. Any thoughts? Commissioner Levasseur and then Commissioner Gibbs.
Thanks. I know Mr. Gillum had expressed some concern to us before that when we're dealing with setting caps, that's basically creates a lot more potential for litigation exposure. And I just wanted to see if that's still Mr. Gillum's concern. My understanding is that the whole idea of using zoning for this purpose was to create the natural limitation and to basically remove most of that exposure.
Yeah, it's still my opinion that I think decisions that are based upon different zoning classifications are generally going to be more easily to defend than decisions that are based upon caps and or determination as to what the best fit for the community is. So again, there are no guarantees either way. I think it was Jessica said earlier, there's a good chance you're going to get sued either way. I mean, I think that's probably safe. I think we're going to have a huge demand for licenses here in Royal Oak, probably more than we're going to want to allow. And I think it's inevitable that sooner or later by somebody, they're going to want to take us to task for a decision that we've made, or try to anyway.
Commissioner Gibbs?
Okay, finally, I couldn't find the unmute button. I think that no matter how we go about doing this, we're going to get hit with a lot of lawsuits. Royal Oak is a high demand area. That's a given. People were after Royal Oak a year and a half ago. People were after Royal Oak right when this started being talked about, before it was even law. Minimizing the risk for litigation is probably our best bet. The zoning is the best idea. We can limit it by parking, things along that nature. I can't see any place in Royal Oak we can put this where it's not going to be close to residential areas. And that's a huge concern for me, because there's not going to be any downtown, and you guys all live, most of you guys live downtown. I live way out on the West End. I live by Woodward. I really don't want a marijuana place by my house. I'm not, it's not that I don't support having that kind of business in the city. I just don't want it near my house. So I don't know that there's a good way of doing it. No matter what we do, we're going to get sued. The city is going to be sued.
Anybody else? Well, maybe I know Commissioner Perush, I mean, for those that are interested in the cap number as a potential, you know, and I know there's Commissioner Douglas and I think Commissioner Lavasser and to some extent Commissioner Gibbs kind of are kind of focused more on the zoning method to, you know, affect the cap versus an outright cap. And there are pros and cons for sure. Commissioner Perush kind of gave an idea of what her thought was for a number. Is anyone else willing to kind of express their idea of what they're thinking if you were to go with a hard cap or a number that the zoning ordinance, you may even want to target with the zoning ordinance? Commissioner Macy?
I was going to say 10.
Okay. Mr. Gillum?
I guess when you're asking for a number, are we talking about the retail licenses, or what kind of a license are we talking about?
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say right now, everyone shake your head no, but we're kind of focused on the retail environment right now. I think the consensus, if I remember last time, and Commissioner Dubuck brought it up, and now it triggers my memory, is that for everything else in the industrial area, that zoning map is just going to take care of itself. It's just going to cap out itself. Commissioner Macy?
So actually, when I say 10, I mean 10 establishments of any kind spread throughout the city. So that would be inclusive of those industrial.
Okay, how about just for retail, Commissioner Macy? Okay. Was that a 5 sideways?
That was a somewhat less than 10.
Okay. Commissioner Perush?
My 5 is all categories. No more than 5 of any kind.
Okay, do you have a feeling about retail at all? Or are you just more like 5 of any kind?
I'm more comfortable with just 5 of any kind. And if it turns out that they're all retail, that's fine. But if it gets split, 3 growers and 2 retailers, that would be fine with me too.
Commissioner Douglas.
But I don't know how, if we are going to set criteria and evaluate applicants, how do we evaluate a grower versus a retail operation, or a processor versus a grower? I mean, they function differently. They have different operational standards. I don't know that you can make that comparison. I'm far more comfortable, if we are going to put limits on it, and I don't want to put limits on it, limiting retail and let the other uses, which are confined to industrial zoning, come as they may.
Mr. Perush?
It's my understanding that for each category, there are different criteria. There might be some similarities based upon your experience, your financial status, your owner operational status, and so on and so forth between, let's say, the 6 categories. But then from that point, you can make some differentiations depending upon the category. For example, if you've got a grower, you might put a criteria in there about ability to control odors outside of the facility. Whereas a retail establishment, you might not think that that's an appropriate criteria to have in your list because there's no chance that that's going to be an issue. So I think you can fine tune the criteria to make them applicable to the various criteria, so that when you get in 20 applications, you can divide them and go from there and evaluate all the growers, all the retailers, all the whatevers.
Right, but I think Commissioner Douglas does bring up a valid point. Even with that point, Commissioner Perush, I think you're right. But picture the case where we have 50 grower applications and 50 retail applications. Okay, we got to narrow it down to 5. Do we just, and then, I mean, you pick 3 retail, 2, or if the growers are all really good, you just allow the growers. How do you sort that out a little bit,
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think maybe somebody like Berkeley or some of the other communities that have a point system can use the point system to say, okay, this is the highest point, this is the next highest point, this is the next highest point, and then there's your 5 or 10 or whatever. But if we're not going to use a point system, which I don't think is a good idea because of the inherent risk in it, then perhaps we do have to establish, or initially, out of the 5, we're going to have 3 retailers and 2 growers and nobody else, or whatever we decide.
Commissioner
Can
Dubak?
I say something?
Yes, Mr. Forshee.
I was just gonna say, I think most that we've seen have put a cap on each individual, just because there's the difference between a grower and, say, a lab are very different. A lab, for example, a lot of people think of as being very unobtrusive, and you wouldn't really even know what's in the building. We all recognize that retailers may have more parking issues or some other concerns, but it would be hard to. I think it would be difficult to pit a grower versus a retailer, and try to suss out which one is more likely to succeed. So I guess I would recommend, even if you just say this type 0, this type 0, this type 5, this type 3, this type 0, or this type unlimited. We've done that too. I think we maybe did unlimited micro businesses or something like that. But yeah, if you put them in their buckets, and those are the licenses that they're going to get from the state as well, then it all kind of lines up together. Your state license and your municipal license can kind of be evaluated fairly.
I agree with Tom 100%. We would strongly recommend that you list all the different types, and then after each one, say growers class A, unlimited, growers class B, unlimited, processors, unlimited, retailers in zoning district, unlimited, and then, retailers in a different district, 3. I don't think you can have them competing, different types of licenses competing in a pool of 5, because you'd be comparing apples and oranges. I think that would really make your ordinance vulnerable, just so you know. So I think you will have to decide how many of each, whether it's unlimited or whether there's a cap.
Yeah, and if we have less concern with labs and growers, why not just let the zoning ordinance take care of those? Because that appears like, seems the opinion with the experts is that's lower risk of getting sued, and just narrow your risk to the most, I don't want to say controversial, but the most dynamic of these elements, which is probably the retail establishments. Commissioner Lavasser.
Something that Mr. Forshey said kind of struck me for a moment. My recollection is that we were advised at one point that we did not have the option of saying zero this category, zero this category, but we will allow some of these other categories of establishments. And I'm just wondering if my recollection was incorrect, or if we do have that option, say, okay, we want zero growers, but we will allow so many retailers.
You do have that option.
Yeah, Tom, let me jump in on that. I think that was information that I originally had given to the commission based upon my reading of the statute. But my understanding is that there have been subsequent information, I don't know if it's anything formal, but that has come out from the state indicating that you can, in fact, have different numbers of licenses for the different classes.
Yeah. I think initially it came out that if you allow one, you have to allow them all. And I think that was sort of our original baseline, but as it was finessed, you know, you could, obviously, if you were a community that wasn't really fit for industrial operations, but you wanted to have a retail operation, you know, sounds like we have a medium, at least to fix for that flexibility.
I remember that interpretation when it first came out because it wasn't clear in the law. And then there was a debate about it. And then the law was clarified to suggest that you can, in fact, distinguish between and pick and choose the licenses you allow. So I remember that. That's how it's progressed since it came out.
I think for me, you know, I look at it, this is really a retail-oriented discussion, I think. I mean, for me, most of the other uses, labs, I'm not worried about at all. I think you can go with any number there. In fact, that's a professional business, whether they're testing DNA or testing the quality of a food or drug or whatever it may be. You know, I think to me, that's fine. I don't see a big hazard. It's a 9-to-5 business. I don't really see that being an issue. It can help fill some office space, other space. I think that the growers, I think, should be limited to the industrial area, and we allow the zoning map to take care of that issue. I think the processors as well. You know, transport, I'm holding off right now. I think that's kind of a different thing. But the retail, for me, I think is going to be the most visible. It's going to cause the most impact on our traffic, our neighborhoods, our rents. And to me, that's the one I think that, you know, most people are interested in. We'll probably get the most applications for the retail establishments. I don't see 10,000 growers coming here when they could go 20 minutes away and get rent for, you know, a tenth of what they'd pay in Royal Oak. You know, for me, I'm in the 3 to 5 range as far as retail establishments out of the gate. And I think that can at any time be lifted. We can lift it as an economic tool. We can lift it as, you know, we see, you know, demand for the services. But for me, that's kind of where my head's at. It doesn't sound like it's too far from others that we've at least heard from that, you know, are on board with any sort of cap. But that's where my head's at. Anybody else? Commissioner DeBuck, did you have your hand or did I miss you? Sorry, I'm trying. If you see what I'm seeing right now, it's hard. I'm using both eyes, going cross-eyed and way-eyed here to make sure I see your hand raised.
No, but I think retail is the focus. I mean, if someone has reason to think we should limit one of the others, they should flag that. But I think retail has been our focus.
So if we focus on retail, maybe going back to the cap zoning, I mean, I see kind of Commissioner Lavasser, Commissioner Gibbs really leaning more towards the, you know, just let the zoning do it, perhaps. Not closed-minded, but just saying I kind of get that sense. I get a sense Commissioner Douglas is in that realm too, but maybe a little flexible. And it sounds like maybe the rest are more, whoa, the screen's just switched. And the rest of us are maybe more leaning towards a cap on retail. Maybe Commissioner Douglas, did I characterize that correctly? Commissioner Lavasser, Commissioner Macy? Yes, Commissioner Douglas.
Yeah, I have no interest in a cap other than at all.
Okay. Commissioner Gibbs, you're motioning to the screen.
Trying to figure out where the mute button is again. I would prefer to see not more than 5 retail establishments, and the other ones I think would they would filter themselves out by the zoning, and that I don't think there's an issue with any of the other ones, any of the other establishments except for the retail ones. And I would prefer a cap no more than 5.
Okay, so we're kind of all hanging in that same, not 50, not 1, kind of in that, at least for the ones that have spoke up so far.
We lost Mr. Forshee, just so that you know.
Oh, is that why my screen changed all over the place? Okay.
He said that he's going to jump right back on. For some reason, he got kicked off, so he'll be right back. If I could add one more thing about retail, as long as we're talking about this, you can also limit the number of retail licenses per zoning district. Not to give you more to think about, but you can also do it that way. So you could say, oh, we'll allow 3 retails in the BH1 zoning and unlimited in a different zoning, and you can distinguish amongst your zoning districts if you want to get that far into the weeds.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about a lot of stuff. The open issues that I still see on the table that we have to debate is, you know, some of the smaller business, neighborhood business districts that Commissioner Perush brought up, the central business district, potential for overlays, and then within the licensing, if we go down that route where we do have a cap, you know, are people generally against the formulaic criteria? And do we generally, if we do go down that route where we have a cap and which triggers the application/selection process, you know, criteria process, do we want to take the risk and have more subjective criteria? Do we like what Mr. Forshee presented? And do we like the potpourri approach versus a, you know, 2 points, 3 points type system? Any thoughts on that from the colleagues? Commissioner Macy.
I think I've already made my point, but I'll say again that I'm in favor of having as many of these criteria as we think are legally sustainable to have. It looks to me like a lot of other cities that have done this have put in some that could be very easily argued are not exactly tied to the business operation. So I think it's worth looking at what other cities have done. And so I think I'm in favor of the scoring. I guess I'm a little unclear on the potpourri situation, but I'm in favor of the, you know, you get points for meeting criteria and then you add them all together. And then if you're cut off, then you make the list of ones to be considered.
Anybody else? Commissioner Douglas?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree, and I'm going to go along with what council has said, that a point system is any decision-making process is fraught, but a point system is fraughter than the process that they've described.
Commissioner Perush?
I would agree with that. I think a point system is a lawsuit waiting to happen because it's just too subjective. I think that we can fine-tune the criteria enough so that we can eliminate a lot of the subjectivity. But on the other hand, I think a point system is just, you know, how do you differentiate between somebody gets 24 points and somebody gets 22? To me, that's just a nightmare. So I would prefer strongly recommend not a point system.
I'm in the similar boat with the point system as well. I think that, it creates, on the advice of counsel, it creates a unnecessary risk. And I think that clearly with the potpourri approach, with the criteria, I think you'll be able to easily start to source it down. You're more likely to get a people that all have the same score and you're back to square one. You know what I mean? Versus being able to, maneuver with more objective criteria and balancing it against the other objective criteria. Commissioner Macy?
So again, just looking at this chart of where this is allowed in the state, and it looks like a lot of cities, a lot of pretty big cities are using points of some kind. And I guess I'm still confused on what the alternative is. Maybe I don't understand potpourri, but you're saying everyone who applies and meets the eligibility criteria, all hundreds of them are in the one that some person will consider. And there's no means of deciding which are qualified and which are not, other than the fact that they're eligible to apply.
So it'd be similar to like how we look at site plans, is my understanding, right? So you have some criteria, and you're not, like when we do site plan approvals on the planning commission, we don't get out our calculators and add up the ranks and scores and say your plan's approved. We don't say, oh, I don't like the color of your building, I'm not going to approve this. That's a no-no. You can't do that. Or, you know what, your business sucks, even though it's allowed. I don't want you here. You're a terrible human. No, we don't do that. What we do look is we have certain criteria for the site plan that we have to, evaluate. And it's objective in its nature, but it can often be subjective in its interpretation sometimes among the different experience levels with the commissioners. But we use that as the guideline for our approvals. And in this case, it would be for our discussion among the applicants. Commissioner Perush?
The danger in using that kind of a system without any points, though, is if, especially initially, you get 25 applications for 5 spots, and 10 of them are almost identical in terms of how you would rank them and how you would evaluate them, and then how do you choose? So going back to the lottery system that we discussed earlier, I think might be a good component to include, just so that if you run into that situation, especially after the initial application period where you just get swamped with applications and 50% of them are pretty darn good and meet all the criteria, then you have an alternative as a way to decide who wins and who loses. There might be a downside to that I'm not seeing, but it seems to me that might be necessary in order to make the distinction, or in order to make the choice.
I think that's a really good point, because you're with so many applications, if you got 3 applications, sometimes it's pretty easy. This one's clearly the worst, and we'll debate among the 2. But if you have like 50, you're going to have certainly groupings of folks, and that lottery might need to be part of it. That's a good point. And I think Commissioner, we'll go to, did anyone else have their hand up? Commissioner Dubuck?
I think a system where people qualify into a lottery makes sense to me. Although, isn't there some precedent for us using a point-based scoring system and staff analyzing and awarding bidders for contracts? I feel like we've seen that before, where staff from different departments are analyzing proposals and awarding points, and then making a recommendation based on those scores. Am I making that up? I feel we've done that. We do that in bidding process. So I don't think it's beyond the pale to say that we can have individuals using criteria to award points and then start a conversation from there. But I think, qualifying in and a lottery makes sense.
Mr. Gillum?
Commissioner Dubuck, I think the engineering department might have a point system to rank their pre-qualified contractors. And maybe that's what you're thinking of. So.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm thinking of. It's not just based on price, but experience, and they talk to other people about them, and they look at some of their business operations and things. They apply scores to them.
that one tiebreaker, which is price, which is tough for us. We don't have that lever here. I mean, if it was like, hey, what's your community benefit? Well, he's okay and she's better, but he's going to give $10 million to the city for new park development. Well, we weighted it up and we went with price. I think that's a little bit more challenging in this case because we can't look at some of those things or consider, on a voluntary basis, but even if they voluntarily put it out there, you technically can't consider those things. And I think I just want to address one thing that Commissioner Macy brought up, and I think it's important to talk about it a little bit. She talked about, well, all the other cities are doing this, and I was actually pretty encouraged by her first statement, and I agree, like, hey, if we're all in this together, we're all going to get sued the same. But there is one small distinction that's rattling in the back of my mind with that logic is that, Royal Oak is the hotbed of Michigan for these applications, unequivocally, on a doubt. Maybe Mr. Forshee and Ms. Wood, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but definitely in Oakland County. And we are going to be the target. We are going to have the most applicants, the most likely to get sued, the most potential for lawsuits. Just my opinion, just because folks are going to want to be here and they have a lot to gain and they have a lot of money to spend, because they foresee this as the market, for Oakland County, at least South Oakland County, for retail establishments, et cetera. So I think that there is one thing to be careful there is that, remember, even though other cities are doing some things, we got a target on our back as far as folks wanting to locate here. And when you have a target on your back, you have a target on your back. Just an FYI on that one, I guess. So I'm seeing, if we do go down, from what I heard with the conversation, if we do go down the path of, doing a licensing /cap with criteria, maybe other than Commissioner Macy, I see, I don't want to say consensus, but I see, thoughts maybe forming in the area of, a cap in the 3 to 5 range. I see thoughts expressed that say we should avoid, there are some distinctions Commissioner Macy noted, that maybe we avoid a point system. I see thoughts that say, okay, if we go in and, we look at this potpourri criteria and we find that we have a bunching of folks that far exceed the number of applications, then, or the number of the cap, then we could go to a lottery system to supplement that, all things being equal. Does anyone have any strong objection to my interpretation of what I kind of felt here and saw? I'm trying to recap it to give staff a little bit more help. Commissioner Douglas.
I don't know, Mayor, I'm going to throw this out here. What would you say to a series of votes? Just to be clear on where we stand. I've developed a list of 4 areas with some sub decisions there. A quick series of votes to settle for staff what some of these conditions are going to be.
I'm not against it, but I think the work session that might be a little bit more challenging. Mr. Gillum?
Mr. Mayor, you took the words right out of my mouth. That's really not authority that the commission has at a work session. So.
But I like the idea, Commissioner Douglas. But hopefully maybe, if we get something for one of the upcoming meetings where we can do this, whether it's a special meeting or a regular city commission meeting, that we have at least maybe a baseline where we have a potential proposed ordinance and we have a potential proposed zoning. And, if there is some debate about some of the nuances, we can be, Mr. Gillum, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have to necessarily vote up and down on the entire ordinance. If you write it cleverly, we can, or maybe we just write it where it's not a vote up and down on the ordinance, it's just vote up and down on direction to write an ordinance. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I think it's worth exploring, but how would you see that unfolding?
Yeah, I think you can do that. At a regular posted meeting, you could vote on parts of an ordinance for purposes of providing direction. Absolutely. So.
Okay. Ms. Wood.
Would it be helpful for us to give you sort of a template of a regulatory ordinance, and when we have them, with blanks for you to fill in terms of who's going to make the decision, and have the different license types listed, and then you can decide, how many you want for each? Would it be helpful for you to have something to look at, just like a template regulatory ordinance to get started? Just a thought, we could provide that.
Well, and I think that's a good idea, and I would even take that a step further. I mean, I kind of call that a piece of clay, right, to start working with. Mr. Gillum, what's your opinion on if we were to get that and individually provide you our commentary based on our discussions today? Would that be helpful for you to kind of make, I mean, whatever you do, you're not going to make everybody happy. If you try to make everyone, I mean, if you can, you shouldn't be sitting in that seat. You should be making, tens of millions of dollars solving the world's problems. But how do you see that unfolding in that sort of situation?
Yeah, that would be entirely permissible if we circulated a document to the 7 of you individually, and then if you provided comments back to the 3 of us, back to Jessica, Tom, and myself individually, or collectively. But yeah, that would be entirely appropriate. Sure.
Commissioner Douglas.
So you're speaking of a regulatory ordinance. Is that what you mean from what you said earlier about the police powers? And that would be in addition to the draft ordinance that we already have and different from that?
I believe what you have so far is the zoning ordinance. Is that correct?
No, we also have a draft adult marijuana establishments.
Yeah, licensing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. Jessica, just FYI for you. Yeah, Laura had provided us with a draft of a regulatory ordinance before. And then the zoning ordinance is one that staff in the planning division developed. So
based on today's work session, you might be able to update that licensing ordinance based on kind of what you heard, and then run it by us again, provide you the feedback, take your best stab at what you think would work, and then at the commission table, we can, pull a series of votes and finesse the ordinance a little bit. If Melanie is really set on 6 and Kyle's really set on 2, and there's a motion made and all that, rigmarole, we settle in on a number, and then boom, at least that part's done. And then, we hit the zoning map, we flip to the zoning ordinance, and, we've done this in piecemeal on lots of things before. Actually, Commissioner Douglas is the champion of breaking things out at planning. She's very effective with this strategy to say, okay, let's focus on what we agree on. We agree on this, right? Okay, now let's talk about the sign height. I don't see that as a bad strategy. And then maybe what we do here is kind of talk through a few more of the outstanding pieces that the legal staff would need to know to go down that path. How does everyone feel about that? I see thumbs up. I see nodding heads. Unless Commissioner Macy's shaking her laptop, I'll take that as a nodded yes. Okay. All right. So just to level set, and I know you guys are getting annoyed with me because everyone has different ideas on this, and the one that tries to bring it together shouldn't be the target. I see that we've had some discussion, at least about, the types of licenses and maybe how we manage those with the, all others other than retail. We focus on retail. The rest can kind of be managed through zoning. Retail, we kind of gave our staff a little bit of an idea of like, if we go down that, doesn't mean everyone agrees that we go down that path, but if we do, we kind of gave some input as far as, the potpourri, I'll use that word, versus, a mathematical formula. We've given some input on the lottery. So I think we've made some progress in a lot of those areas. And I think the criteria, I think, is something that we can give feedback back to staff, and see what sort of common themes pop up. If I'm the only guy that says, let's move with green infrastructure, okay, then maybe they note it, but they don't put it in there, and then, we can make a motion. But, we kind of give our feedback there. And then this brings us really circling back a little bit more towards, the where question. And it sounds like we have, at least a little bit of agreement as far as non-retail in the industrial area. Retail, industrial, business, some debate that needs to be had about the CBD, some debate that needs to be had about the neighborhood business, let's say, for example, some of the other areas that are more affordable, which I think is a prudent discussion we should have. And then, of course, if there's any overlay discussion, I push that off a little bit to see what the result is of because overlays get a little bit more complicated. So maybe we talk and get our questions answered a little bit more related to central business district and neighborhood business. And so maybe if we want to direct the conversation right now on that realm and use our time here to kind of focus on those. Once we get done with that, I think then we're starting to get to a place where staff can probably start to generate something. Am I off base, Mr. Gillum, with that? I don't want to speak for you. If you kind of follow that play, is that something that will help you?
Well, I think it would, and yeah, I was going to encourage you to talk about retailers and about microbrewers or microprocessors too.
Microprocessor. Okay, can I pivot a little bit, guys? I know I just said that, but we haven't talked a lot about microprocessors. Maybe we can get a little bit more information and get questions answered related to microprocessors right now. Just question time on microprocessors. Any questions on microprocessors? Commissioner Douglas. Then Commissioner Mason.
Yeah, I like the idea of micro businesses. But in earlier discussions and in the Planning Commission, we talked about waiting on them until we get sort of the more formal framework established. When we talk about creating overlay districts, Mr. Twing and Mr. Hedges are vigorously nodding their heads invisibly when I say that setting up overlay ordinances would be another 6 months. To identify them, to set the boundaries, to hold the public hearings, to write the ordinances. And once we establish those overlay districts, that cheap property is suddenly going to be expensive property. So I like the idea of micro businesses, but if we want to get this done and we've pushed the staff to get this done by August 15th, I don't think we can fold that into what we're doing.
I had Commissioner Macy and then Commissioner Dubak.
Point well taken by Commissioner Douglas about the timing and not wanting to wait 6 months for that. I just was going to ask, I think Ms. Wood said something about there are some of the communities they've worked with have set no limit on micro businesses, and I just wondered why. What was the thinking behind that, if you know?
It might just have been as simple as they didn't think they were going to get many interested applicants for that. It just varies from community to community so much. If you're asking me what the rationale was for just leaving them unlimited, is that what you're saying? Yeah, just not concerned about getting too many applications, I think.
Just on that point, I'll go, sorry, sorry, Commissioner Macy, you're not finished?
Well, I just had one other little thought, thinking about what Commissioner Douglas was saying. So, I mean, could we write in our ordinance, these are permitted in these overlay districts and not make the overlay districts yet? So they'd have to wait for us to get that part in place. Commissioner Douglas is saying, no, we can't do that. I mean, it's possible to have something that can be only in a zone that doesn't exist, right? I mean, that was kind of what we talked about for marijuana generally. If it has to be 1,000 feet from such and such kind of a district, or such kind of a zone, could not exist that spot.
Commissioner Douglas, I'll let her. I know I'm going to get to you, Commissioner Dubak, but Commissioner Douglas is the ranking member on the Planning Commission. She can help answer that question.
Well, you know what? I'm going to defer to Mr. Twing or Mr. Hedges here if they're still with us. I see Tim is unmuted.
Mr. Twing.
I guess, can I hear the question again?
Yeah. So Commissioner Douglas was pointing out that if we want to make these overlay districts for things like a micro business, it will take another 6 months for us to get that underway. And she's saying we don't want to delay the rest of it that long. And so I said, well, could we say micro businesses are permitted in such a kind of a zone or such a kind of an overlay district before we've actually created the zone that allows for it?
Well, we've already said micro businesses and retail businesses in the draft that's in front of you are permitted in the general business and the industrial district. So both of those are currently allowed under the draft that's in front of you, and that was in first reading. If you want to add it to another district, no, you'd have to go back, amend the ordinance to allow it in neighborhood business or the CBD or create the overlay district. So anything you do to change the text of the ordinance allowing micro businesses as a special land use, you would have to go back and amend. Right now, we're running up on the deadline for cutoff for the July Planning Commission meeting. So any amendment that adds to the zoning ordinance at this point is going to take some time to draft, some time for Dave and legal to look at it, and then do the public hearing notices. And I would think any amendment would be very difficult to meet by the August deadline that you currently have. Do I think it would take 6 months? No, but that's assuming the Planning Commission only holds one public hearing. They held 3 on the current draft. So
the question I'm asking is slightly different than what you answered. So you're telling me even to make any changes at all, it will take quite some time. But yes. Commissioner Douglas was saying to create this special zone. So there seems to be some appetite for micro businesses to maybe be in these overlay districts or in a special kind of zoning. To create that part alone would take 6 months, regardless of the changes to the ordinance, which I think looks like it's happening either way. And so I was go ahead.
Either way, it's an amendment to the ordinance. With an overlay district, you're going to identify the geographic boundary as well, but you're also going to have text to go with that overlay. So you're amending the zoning ordinance. The process to amend the zoning ordinance is the same, whether it's a text amendment or the geographic map amendment. We follow the same process. And the requirement is at least one public hearing in front of the Planning Commission. We have to give notice to everyone at least 15 days before that meeting. And prior to that, we have to actually write the text of the amendment so people have it available to review. And we'd also have to post it in the paper, or at least a portion of it in the paper. Assuming the Planning Commission holds one public hearing and not 2 or 3, then it would have to go to the City Commission for 2 readings. Minimally, I think you'd be looking at 3 months to get all of that done. That's if everything went well. As I said, this last draft that went to the Planning Commission for what we currently have in front of you, they held 3 public hearings before it was presented to you at the City Commission in December. And we're still talking about the zoning ordinance text. So yes, can it take 6 months? Absolutely. Minimally, I would say it'd be 3 months.
Commissioner Prush, or I'm sorry, Commissioner Dubuck, then Commissioner Prush.
So with the understanding, which we didn't have as much clarity in December, but we can limit certain license types to certain areas and cap certain license types in certain zoning areas, right? So we would need an overlay to say that we were going to license 1 micro in the CBD, correct?
You're talking 2 different things. You got a licensing ordinance that you're talking about through Mr. Gillum and the outside counsel, and they're drafting that regulatory, and that's where you get into the cap and the number that you're currently talking about potentially doing. That's totally separate from the zoning ordinance. It's a totally separate process, and the City Commission is the only body that's involved in that as far as reviewing and approving it. The zoning ordinance is where you still have to indicate what you're permitting in terms of a permitted land use or a special land use and the type of land use. We do not allow micro businesses in the CBD. And again, in order to do that under either an overlay or in the district itself, we're going to have to go back through and amend the ordinance to allow it to go there.
So the ordinance is before us because it's not an allowable use in the CBD. Whether we're talking about an overlay or amending uses in the CBD, that's the same process.
Right. The ordinance in front of you does not allow them anywhere other than general business or the general industrial.
So my concern that I've raised since the beginning is the need to ensure that there's a competitive space for micro businesses. Just because I don't want massive industries and those with all the capital at this industry and not allow for local small businesses to actually thrive in a new industry that's being birthed in our state and in our community. So if there is a way, I guess, as we're talking about our ordinance, to allow, if we're allowed to cap different types, so we can ensure that there's space for micros to survive in our current zoning that's been proposed or that we've gotten to the table, that's acceptable to move forward that way. But I do think we need to continue on parallel tracks, talking about uses in neighborhood, business, and CBD.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. I think from the beginning we've talked about the various tranches, right? Tranche 1, start out, get everything out there, learn, and then this is an evolving, breathing creature. One of the reasons why maybe we're behind on this is because your option to do it fast is to either, take it slow at one piece at a time, or to entirely open up the floodgates and just allow everything. And probably the latter is not the most advisable. So I think from the beginning, we've talked about the various tranches of this. I'm wondering too, maybe the implications, and I'd like to know what my colleagues and our legal team thinks, but if you go with, let's say, 2 or 3 retail establishments, but you allow 4 to 5 micros in all of the areas that are currently in the ordinance as it's gone through planning, does that encourage applicants maybe to really start to lean towards the micro? Because I think the people where I look, when they voted for this, they voted for it for any number of reasons, but I don't think that they voted to have the equivalent of a fireworks store on Woodward Avenue. I think they were more thinking, I want access to this product, and I would love to go to a cool little shop and that's locally owned and a micro place or a small retailer that my neighbor owns it or whatever, not like a big fireworks store. And I think maybe there is some merit to looking at limiting the traditional retail to a certain number, and then treating micro as like a retailer and increasing that amount, which may lead to more applications in that realm and maybe more success in that realm. I had Commissioner Perush and then Commissioner Douglas.
Based on what you just said, I think that's the way that I am comfortable going. When I mentioned perhaps expanding certain uses into a neighborhood business zone, I didn't realize what Mr. Twing just described was that is going to take another amendment to the zoning ordinance, and we're going to be into that 3 to 6 month process. And I certainly don't want to go down that road. So I think taking this in a step-by-step approach and maybe doing that later is the way to go. But I like your thought about identifying a number and then making sure that, let's say we pick 5, only 2 are retail and 3 are micro businesses. That at least gives micro businesses an opportunity to try to establish a business within the zones that we've already designated in the ordinance, which are the industrial and general business. So I think that's maybe the way to handle it. I think you're right.
Commissioner Douglas?
Well, the feedback I've had from the micro businesses is that they can't afford Woodward Avenue. I mean, right now they are able to locate there. They're allowed in that general business zoning, but they said it's too expensive. And the CBD is going to be the same case. If you did want to allow a few, the most expedient way to do it would just be to say they are allowed in neighborhood business zoning. I think you might get some citizen pushback on that, maybe not. But that would be a way to do it. And neighborhood business zoning is pretty much up and down our major corridors, 11 Mile, parts of Main Street, parts of Crooks and Rochester. So that would probably be where you would find them. And if you limit the number, you're not going to have property owners in those corridors hunkering down on their values. But if you do decide with an overlay district, if you say we want it, between Gardenia and Blair on 11 Mile, then you're talking about the more drawn out process.
Mr. Perush?
But even adding the neighborhood business category for micro businesses, isn't that going to require a same kind of zoning ordinance amendment that Mr. Twing just described?
Yes.
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 You're changing the text of what has already been approved on first reading.
Oh, right. Right, that's right. Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
So what I think is maybe going back to the tranches, I think we can still open it up. We can still launch this thing, and we can still work on it 3 to 6 months from now. No one says you have to stop. No one says this is the final. I think you get moving. And I actually think it's a better way, because start to get more information to help you decide. I mean, if we make a mistake, the numbers we're talking about with the caps are low. It's not like we're making a mistake with 20 businesses. So if we want to, keep the numbers lower, and then in the next 6 months direct staff to say we want to look at micros in the neighborhood business district with these restrictions and caps, and we want to look at the central business district with these restrictions and caps, then we can go through that 3 to 6 month process. And during that time, we're going to learn a lot more about our application process. We're going to learn a lot more about, neighborhood feelings on these things. And honestly, if the micros have a chance in the neighborhoods, to me, I think that it would be better to see the neighborhoods get familiar with these type of businesses in our community before you put them in their back door, literal back door. Because I think that there's still, there's obviously issues with parking and all that, but these aren't drug dealerships. They're different, and you don't want to pull the skin off the cat all at once. My opinion, but no one's going to stop us from making this an iterative process.
Mayor, I have one more question on your list of topics, at least for the zoning ordinance.
Yes, Mr.
It's come up briefly this evening and in the past. Right now, we are still dealing with medical marijuana facilities in this document. And my question is it the consensus of the commission that you don't want to process those and go forward with medical marijuana?
Yeah, and I just like to remind the commission, we looked at the past, we did have input from both our police chief as well as our city attorney. I think that the medical marijuana, there was some discussion like, hey, do you really need it if you have the recreational? But also with the medical marijuana, our police chief did bring up some concerns that ordinance induces that the recreational ordinance does not, or the recreational law does not. So while I remember correctly that the police chief didn't pose or show any strong objections to the recreational, he did have some policing concerns related to the medical, not related to the care of people, but with some of the transport and sometimes the interesting activities that can come with it. So I just want to remind everybody, but any thoughts on that? And now that I expressed mine.
Well, I only bring it up because right now it's in the draft that you've got in front of you in first reading. If you would like to eliminate it, I would have staff eliminate those sections and revise for second reading. I do believe, and Dave can confirm whether he concurs or not, but I do believe we can take things out of a draft that's in front of you. Obviously, if we're trying to add it to new districts, I believe it'd have to go back through for more hearings. But I believe you could delete some things out of between first and second reading.
Commissioner Douglas, then Commissioner Macy, and then Commissioner Perush.
Yeah, I've never seen a sense of the two parallel ordinances. You know, people who need medical marijuana can buy it through a retail store. Their providers can purchase it and easily transport it for them. I think we will meet the needs of the medical community and the recreational community just with a recreational ordinance.
Commissioner Macy and then Commissioner Parush.
So that is what I thought too after the last meeting, but I have been told otherwise by the medical marijuana community that it in fact is not as good for meeting their needs. And I think there's a cost issue that is involved with this, and I feel like that's something I want to be meeting the needs of the people who have them. So I just was raising my hand to say that I already stated my position on this.
Commissioner Parush.
I personally don't see any need for a medical marijuana. I think the recreational can handle it. We can certainly rethink that later on if we find out that there's a niche there that is being unmet for whatever reason. But at the present time, I would take it out or leave it out.
And I would agree with Commissioner Parush and Douglas. I think that, you know, if we are in the middle of, let's just say, I don't know, Marquette, Michigan, you know, somewhere where you are the town and there's nothing around you, you know, this might be a little different conversation. But I mean, honestly, you know, I think that, you know, people who have access will get access through the recreational ordinance, and those who, from a pricing perspective, with all the transit and everything that's out there, if they need to go to Hazel Park, Madison Heights, within a 2-mile drive from anywhere in Royal Oak, you know, those medical marijuana options are still available as a catch-all in case, you know, the theory is, you know, somewhat flawed. That's sort of my opinion. Okay, Tim, well, I mean, we heard from 3 of us, Commissioner Gibbs, Commissioner Lavasser, Commissioner Dubuck, or you heard from 4 of us rather.
Well, probably what I'll do then is have staff highlight the provisions that are related to medical marijuana facilities in the draft ordinance when it does come back to you for second reading. And if you want to vote to remove it, all of those highlighted areas will be removed.
Okay. That's fair enough. Okay. Well, I'm at a point where we've been on this for almost 3 hours, and I'm starting my diet again, and I'm getting lightheaded drinking tea. At least I'm not cranky yet. So I'm going to defer to Mr. Gillum, Ms. Wood, Mr. Forshee, Mr. Twing, Mr. Hedges. Anything that you think we need to bring up at this point to either get questions answered on from your end or our end or discuss?
So I guess just in terms of next steps, then what we had talked about or what has been discussed would be for Jessica and Tom to provide kind of a template, if you will, of the regulatory ordinance with some different options. And then we can circulate that to the 7 of you, get comments, and then I guess at that point in time, I guess maybe wait to see the breadth of the comments, whether or not at that point we need to have another work session, or if we're at a point where we could potentially bring the agenda to you as a business item on a regular agenda for first reading. I guess those would be my thoughts.
I think that's fair. Commissioners, anything you want to bring up, add, questions? Commissioner Parush?
Does the licensing ordinance need 2 readings, or can that be done in just 1 reading?
The licensing ordinance will require 2 readings.
Okay, and does it require a public hearing?
It does not, no.
Okay, so that time-consuming step is out, but it does take 2 readings. But we could do it in consecutive commission meetings to get it done in 2 readings?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Anybody else? I think, did we hit item number 6, commissioner comments and discussion? Pretty sure we did. I think we hit the agenda items. You know, I mean, just my thoughts. I think this was very productive. I know that there isn't complete consensus among all the components or elements, and then certainly how they all fit together. But I think we all are generally have a sense that this is something we need to do. We have a sense that we want to mitigate our risk with lawsuits. And I think I'm feeling that, we don't want to be, stuck in a hole, but we don't want to be ultra aggressive either. So I don't know how staff qualifies that and manifests it or turns it into a guiding document here. But I think we've made progress. I think we got a lot of our questions answered. I think that, as far as next steps, it feels like everybody's okay with where we're heading with the next steps. Any other closing comments from anybody? Any other final thoughts before, we look to adjourn tonight?
Yes, Mayor.
Yes, Mr. Forsey.
I'm sorry, I cut out there. My computer shut down on me, but so I may have missed this. But was there any consensus about whether the cap concept is in or out, or you're looking for alternatives where there is no cap and one where there would be? Is that's still being debated?
Yeah, I think without taking an actual vote, I mean, there is some consensus that if we don't go strictly down the planning route, that the cap with a lottery would be probably something we're interested in. There's a couple strong Puritan holdouts with the zoning, looking at Commissioner Douglas, which we don't disagree. But, I think that in the event that we go down the cap, or that there is some consensus about limiting the number of establishments, and that a cap is a real plausibility. And if we go down that route, it sounds like the objective criteria, unranked, although we have some dissent, seems to be, maybe more in the realm of where we're seeing consensus. But
Sure. Yeah, I just want to make sure it was still on the menu so that, for consideration, and might help to have, something in front of you to react to and get to consensus. So, okay, I just want to thank you.
What I'm hoping to, Mr. Forsey, is that when we get this packet from staff, that, one of the things where we'll have a little bit more freedom probably is that criteria to say, okay, we have the baseline, some guiding principles on it. And then, if we want to make tweaks or we want to add additional criteria or delete certain criteria, we can provide that back, and, staff can try to do their best to fit that into something they think will work. Knowing if, all 7 of us say one thing, probably should add it in there.
Okay.
If I have a crazy idea, probably shouldn't. So
I took some notes, Tom, so I've got a good sense of what you missed.
Okay.
When you got booted.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, good. Anything else, Mr. Twing? Mr. Gillum?
Not for me.
I just want to thank Jessica and Tom for their help tonight. So.
Yeah, very helpful. We appreciate you taking time and, offering your insights and opinions. I felt your participation was crucial, critical, and very informative. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for
and
having
we
us.
look forward to, coming up with a nice product that you all like. So
we'll get there.
Mr. Gillum, do we need a motion to adjourn?
Yes, please.
Okay. Anyone want to make that motion? We have a motion by Commissioner Perush. Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Gibbs. All right. I'll do a vote starting from the bottom. Commissioner Dubuck. Commissioner Dubuck. He frozen in time? Well, maybe I'll start from the top. Commissioner Douglas?
Yes.
I vote yes. Commissioner Lavasser?
Yes.
Commissioner Macy?
Yes.
Commissioner Gibbs?
Yes.
Commissioner Perush?
Yes.
Commissioner Dubuck?
Yeah.
He's abstaining. Oh, there he is. I think I got a yes. He's frozen. We bored him to death. He's like literally turned into a... I do that to him on purpose. Okay, so I think we're adjourned. And once again, thank you, everyone. And I think we made some sizable steps forward, and let's keep trucking along.
Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.